Hello, I am the Wizard of Tales, and I'm here to guide you today. I know this video is the perfect companion to help my dear dreamers relax and drift off to sleep. Before we dive into a world of calm and serenity, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, get cozy, take a deep breath, and let the magic of stories embrace you. The Harrison family's old mirror had remained untouched in the attic for decades. Sarah, a 16-year-old teenager, had always felt an inexplicable attraction to that object covered in a weathered sheet. That autumn afternoon, while organizing some boxes at her mother's request, her fingers brushed against the dusty fabric that concealed the Victorian mirror. "Don't touch that," warned Emily, her best friend, who was helping her with the cleaning. "My grandmother always said that old mirrors hold stories that are best not awakened." Sarah rolled her eyes, but couldn't hold back a shiver when an icy breath blew through the attic, making the floorboards creak. "Do you really believe in such superstitions? It's just an old mirror." "It's not just any mirror," said Emily, approaching cautiously. "They say it belonged to Mary Sullivan, that woman who mysteriously disappeared in the 50s. Haven't you ever heard the story?" Sarah nodded, her curiosity piqued. The attic, lit only by the dim light coming in through a small circular window, seemed the perfect setting for supernatural stories. Emily sat down in an old rocking chair, which protested with a high-pitched groan. Mary was a young widow who lived alone in the house next door. People said she practiced strange rituals after she lost her young son in an accident. One night, neighbors heard screams coming from her house. When the police arrived, they found only this mirror with scratch marks on the glass. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, but remained skeptical. And how did this mirror get here? Her grandmother bought Mary's house at an auction, along with some furniture. This mirror was one of them. Emily lowered her voice. "They say that if you look closely, you can see dark stains that look like dried blood." At that moment, thunder echoed in the distance, making the two girls jump. The approaching storm cast unsettling shadows across the attic, bringing the covered shapes of the old furniture to life. "Had you ever heard of the Bloody Mary ritual?" asked Emily, her voice almost a whisper. Sarah nodded, who hadn't heard that urban legend. "Well, some people believe that this mirror is especially receptive to that kind of invocation." Sarah laughed nervously, trying to disguise her discomfort. "Don't tell me you want to try." "Of course not," Emily replied quickly. "But today is October 31st, Halloween. If there's ever a time for scary stories, this is it." The rain began to fall outside, its drops drumming on the roof like restless fingers. Sarah found herself staring at the covered mirror, wondering what could be hiding under that dusty sheet. "My mother tells me that her grandmother used to have terrible nightmares after she brought that mirror home," Emily continued. "She used to say that she saw a woman in a white dress stained with blood standing at the foot of the bed, always pointing to the attic." Sarah felt her heart race. The story was stirring her more than she'd like to admit. Why didn't anyone ever get rid of him? "They tried," Emily replied, leaning forward. 3 times. Each time, the mirror mysteriously returned to the attic the next morning. A new clap of thunder, closer now, made the lights flicker. For an instant, Sarah swore she saw movement reflected in the small piece of the mirror that was exposed where the sheet had slipped. "Let's go downstairs," suggested Emily, standing up abruptly. "It's getting late, and your mother asked us to finish before nightfall." But Sarah remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the mirror. There was something hypnotic about it, something that called to her. Without realizing it, she took a step forward, her fingers reaching for the sheet. "Sada." Emily tried to stop her, but it was too late. The fabric slid smoothly away, revealing the mirror in all its dark glory. The frame was adorned with intricate carvings of rose bushes, their flowers and thorns so detailed that they looked real. The glass, although dulled by time, still reflected their images with disturbing clarity. And it was then that Sarah noticed. There were 3 reflections in the mirror, not 2. A pale, hazy figure hovered behind them, its form undefined but undeniably feminine. For an instant that seemed like an eternity, no one moved. The air in the attic became dense, charged with an ancient, malevolent energy. Emily was the first to react, pulling Sarah tightly by the arm. The two stumbled down the stairs, closing the attic door with a bang. Gasping, they looked at each other in the second-floor corridor. Did you see it?" Emily stammered, her face pale as wax. Sarah nodded slowly, unable to form words. Her mind tried to rationalize what she had just witnessed, but there was no logical explanation for that third figure in the reflection. That night, lying in her bed, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the mirror and its mysteries. The storm continued outside, and each flash of lightning seemed to illuminate shadows that shouldn't have been there. In her head, a voice whispered tantalizingly, "3 times? To say my name 3 times?" What Sarah didn't know was that that encounter in the attic had triggered a series of events that would change her life forever. Mary Sullivan's mirror held darker secrets than any urban legend could suggest. And now that it had been discovered, it would not rest until it had completed its purpose. Halloween night was just beginning, and with it, a horror story that had spanned generations was about to repeat itself. Sarah Harrison had inadvertently opened a door to a world of shadows and distorted reflections, and now she would have to face the consequences of her curiosity. Sarah spent the night tossing and turning in bed as the storm continued outside. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that hazy figure in the mirror, its shadowy presence etched into her memory. His cell phone vibrated on the bedside table. It was a message from Emily. "I can't sleep. I keep thinking about what we saw. We need to do more research on Mary Sullivan." Sarah agreed, feeling a mixture of fear and curiosity consume her. She turned on her laptop and started digging through old archives of the local newspaper available in the city's digital library. Emily was right. There was more to the story. The records showed that Mary Sullivan wasn't just a lonely widow. Before her disappearance, she had become a controversial figure in the community. Several people reported unexplained events in her presence, and some even accused her of practicing witchcraft. The most disturbing was the account of her last day, October 31st, 1952. According to the report, neighbors heard Mary reciting something repeatedly before the screams. When the police broke down the door, they found only the mirror in the living room, with nail marks on the glass and drops of blood on the floor. The body was never found. The light in Sarah's room flickered, startling her. In the reflection of the computer screen, for an instant, she swore she saw a pale face watching her. Turning quickly in her chair, she found only her empty room and the dancing shadows caused by the lightning. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a backache from falling asleep in her chair. The sun shone timidly through the clouds that still covered the sky, as if the storm of the night before had never existed. Emily arrived early, carrying a pile of old books. "I found these in my grandfather's library," she explained, spreading the volumes out on Sarah's bed. "They're books about local folklore and the town's history. There are a few mentions of Mary Sullivan and other similar cases." The girls spent the morning immersed in the yellowed pages. They discovered that, before Mary, there had been other mysterious disappearances in the region, all connected in some way to antique mirrors. In each case, the victims reported seeing a woman in a white dress in their reflections days before they disappeared. "Look at this." Emily pointed to a particularly interesting page. According to this legend, antique mirrors can serve as portals to the other side, but they need to be fed. "Fed?" Sarah asked, feeling a chill. "With souls," Emily replied, her voice trembling slightly. Legend has it that spirits trapped between worlds use mirrors to attract victims. Each soul captured makes them stronger. A noise from the attic interrupted the conversation. The two looked at each other, paralyzed. It was as if something was dragging on the floor above them. "It's probably just the house cracking," Sarah tried to rationalize, but her voice sounded unsure. "Sarah," Emily hesitated, "don't you think it's strange that your family never got rid of that mirror? As if something was stopping them." The question hung in the air, heavy as lead. Sarah thought of all the times her mother avoided talking about the attic, how her grandmother always kept the door locked, how no one in the family liked to go up there. "We need to find out more about what happened to Mary," Sarah decided, "and about how she got that mirror in the first place." The girls decided to visit Mary Sullivan's old house, now occupied by an elderly couple. Mrs. Peters, the current resident, greeted them with curiosity when they mentioned Mary's name. "Oh, that poor woman," sighed Mrs. Peters, pouring tea. "My husband and I found some of her things in the basement when we moved in. Letters, diaries. We never had the heart to throw them away." Sarah and Emily exchanged excited glances. Mrs. Peters went upstairs to collect the documents, leaving the girls in the old room. On the walls, several decorative mirrors reflected the afternoon light. "Don't you think there are too many mirrors in here?" Emily whispered uneasily. Before Sarah could answer, Mrs. Peters returned with a dusty box. Among the yellowed papers, they found what appeared to be Mary Sullivan's diary. The last entries were disturbing. "The mirror is calling me again, stronger and stronger. It promises to give me back my Thomas. It says I can see him on the other side, but the price is too high." Sarah felt her heart race as she read those words. Thomas was the name of the son Mary had lost. According to the diary, she had bought the mirror from a mysterious antique dealer who had shown up on her doorstep a few days after the boy's funeral. "There's something else here," Emily murmured, pulling a yellowed envelope from the bottom of the box. Inside, a black and white photograph showed Mary Sullivan standing next to the infamous mirror. But what caught the girls' attention was the reflection caught in the glass. Where Mary's image should have been, there was only a dark, distorted silhouette. The sound of breaking glass upstairs made the three women jump. Mrs. Peters went upstairs to check, leaving Sarah and Emily alone with their disturbing discoveries. "Sarah," Emily whispered, her voice trembling, "look at all those mirrors in the living room. Don't you think they look different now?" Sarah observed the reflections around her. On each mirrored surface, the shadows seemed denser, deeper than they should be, and in each of them, there was a subtle movement, as if something or someone was watching. Mrs. Peters didn't return. The minutes dragged by while Sarah and Emily remained paralyzed in the room, surrounded by increasingly disturbing reflections. The silence was absolute, except for the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. "We need to check that she's all right," Sarah whispered, slowly getting up. Emily grabbed her arm. "We mustn't separate," she replied, her eyes fixed on the mirrors that seemed to pulsate with an energy of their own. Together, they climbed the creaking staircase. In the corridor on the second floor, shards of glass glittered on the floor. One of the mirrors had shattered inexplicably, but there was no sign of Mrs. Peters. "Mrs. Peters?" called Sarah, her voice trembling. No answer. In every room they checked, they found more mirrors, some covered by sheets, others exposed, all emanating an aura of malevolence that made their hearts race. "Sarah, look at this." Emily pointed to an ajar door at the end of the corridor. It was a small office, its walls covered in yellowed newspaper clippings. As they approached, they realized that they were all about mysterious disappearances over the decades. "They weren't just stories," Emily muttered, studying the clippings. "It's happened before. Many times." A pattern began to emerge. Each disappearance was connected to old mirrors, and they all occurred in 7-year cycles. The last documented case was that of Mary Sullivan in 1952. "Wait," Sarah calculated mentally. "If the pattern continues, this year, it's the next cycle," Emily added, her face pale. A loud thud from upstairs startled them both. It was coming from the attic. Sarah held tightly to Mary's diary, which she still carried, feeling that its pages held crucial answers. Determined to find Mrs. Peters, they went up to the attic. The door was ajar, a dim light escaping through the crack. As they entered, their eyes took a while to adjust to the dimness. The attic was a labyrinth of old mirrors, all uncovered, their reflections multiplying the space infinitely. In the center, on a round table, there was an open book and a candle that had almost been consumed. "It's a grimoire," Emily whispered, approaching the book. "Look at these notes. They're rituals for communicating with the other side." Sarah flipped through Mary's diary, looking for connections. The last few pages revealed a frightening truth. Mary hadn't simply disappeared. She had discovered a ritual to bring her son back, using the mirrors as portals. "She wasn't the first," Sarah read aloud. "The mirror It travels from person to person, promising to fulfill their deepest desires. But it's a trap. A movement in the reflections caught her eye. For an instant, all the mirrored surfaces showed the same image. A woman in a white dress, stained with blood, holding the hand of a small child. "Thomas," an ethereal voice echoed through the attic. "Is that you, my son?" The girl slowly turned around. Mrs. Peters was standing in the doorway, but there was something wrong with her gaze. It was empty, glazed. "She's possessed," Emily whispered, stepping back. "No," Sarah realized, "it's Mary. She's never left this house. She's in all the mirrors." The figure of Mrs. Peters advanced mechanically, her hands outstretched. "I need my son. I need to complete the ritual." Sarah flipped frantically through the diary, looking for answers. The pages revealed that Mary had discovered how to use the mirrors to create a network of portals, each fed by the life energy of its victims. "The mirror in your house," Emily said, understanding. "It's not just a portal, it's the original. The first one." The temperature in the attic plummeted. In the reflections, shadows began to move independently, forming distorted silhouettes that contorted and reached towards them. "We need to destroy it," Sarah declared, clutching the diary to her chest. "It's the only way to free them all." But when they tried to move towards the door, they found that they were surrounded. In each mirror, a different version of Mary Sullivan watched them, some crying, others smiling malevolently. "No one leaves," Mrs. Peters / Mary's voice echoed. "Not until the ritual is complete." Sarah realized that it was no coincidence that they had found the mirror in the attic of her house, just as it was no coincidence that they were there at that moment, discovering the truth. The mirror had planned everything, patiently waiting for the right moment to complete its macabre cycle. The candle on the table flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. In each reflection, the images began to distort, revealing glimpses of another world, a place of darkness and despair, where lost souls wandered eternally. "There's something in the diary," Emily said, flipping through the pages quickly. "A counter-ritual." Mary tried to undo what she had started, but she couldn't complete it. The words were interrupted by a high-pitched scream. Mrs. Peters had collapsed, her body writhing on the floor as a dark mist emanated from her eyes and mouth. The mirrors began to vibrate, their surfaces rippling like water. Sarah and Emily found themselves at a crucial moment, surrounded by distorted reflections and a supernatural force that had waited decades for this moment. Whatever they did next would determine not only their fates, but also that of all the souls trapped between the mirror worlds. And at the center of it all, the original mirror waited in its attic, its blackened surface pulsing with an ancient and evil energy, ready to claim its next victims. Sarah gripped the diary with renewed strength, her eyes frantically scrolling through the pages as Emily tried to help Mrs. Peters. The dark mist emanating from the unconscious woman began to take shape in the air, revealing silhouettes that danced like living shadows. "Here," exclaimed Sarah, her finger trembling over a stained page. Mary discovered that the original mirror needs to be destroyed at a specific time, when the veil between the worlds is at its thinnest. "Midnight on Halloween," Emily added, understanding. Exactly when Mary disappeared, the antique clock downstairs began to chime, its chimes echoing through the house like a dark omen. It was only 2 hours to midnight. "But there's more," Sarah continued reading. "The ritual needs to be performed by someone who shares a connection with the mirror. Someone from the lineage of one of the victims." A shiver ran down her spine as the realization hit her. Her grandmother had bought Mary's house and mirror. It was no coincidence. The mirror had chosen her family, waiting patiently for the right moment. The temperature in the attic continued to drop, and now their breaths formed little clouds in the air. In the reflections, Mary's images multiplied infinitely, some crying, others laughing, all coming closer and closer to the surface of the mirrors, as if they were trying to cross them. "Sarah," Emily whispered, her voice trembling, "look at Mrs. Peters." The old woman's body began to transform, her skin acquiring an unearthly pallor. Her eyes, when they opened, were completely black. When she spoke, it was no longer her voice. You don't understand, Mary's voice said through her. It's not just about my Thomas. There are so many others, so many lost souls. We need to set them free. Free them or imprison them? Sarah challenged, holding up the diary like a shield. The mirror doesn't free anyone. It only consumes. A supernatural wind swept through the attic, causing the pages of the grimoire on the table to turn furiously. The flames of the candles danced violently, casting shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. Emily, who had approached the grimoire, began to read aloud. The mirror feeds on pain and loss. The stronger the desire for reunion, the more powerful it becomes. Mary wasn't its first victim. She was just another in a long line of desperate souls. Sarah felt something tug at her mind, like a distant call. Images began to flow into her consciousness. Her grandmother, young and frightened, staring into the same mirror, generations of women before her, all lured by the promise of reunion with lost loved ones. We need to act now, Sarah decided, her voice finding strength. If we wait until midnight, the mirror will be at its most powerful. But the ritual? Emily began to protest. We can't follow his rules, Sarah interrupted. That's how he manipulates us. We need to do something unexpected. At that moment, Mrs. Peters/Mary stood up, her body moving unnaturally. You can't interfere. The cycle must be completed. The surfaces of the mirrors began to ripple like liquid mercury, and spectral hands emerged from them, trying to reach the girls. The air became thick with an ancient, malevolent energy. Sarah looked at the diary in her hands, then at Emily, and finally at the original mirror in her own attic, visible through the window of the neighboring house. An idea began to form in her mind, a dangerous one, but perhaps her only chance. Emily, she said, her voice low and urgent, I need you to trust me. When I tell you run to my house and get the mirror from the attic, bring it here. But Sarah, it's the only way. If we can gather all the mirrors, including the original one, maybe we can overload the ritual, force it to self-destruct. The shadows around them intensified, and Mary's voice echoed throughout the attic. You can't stop what's already in motion. The veil is opening, and all those who were lost will return. Sarah watched the reflections twist and turn, each surface showing a different aspect of the shadowy world beyond the glass. In some, she saw familiar faces, people who had disappeared over the years, all trapped in a limbo between worlds. Now, Emily, Sarah shouted, pushing her friend towards the door as she herself faced the possessed figure of Mrs. Peters. Chaos ensued in the attic. The mirrors vibrated with deafening frequency, their surfaces continually cracking and reconstituting themselves. The dark mist emanating from Mrs. Peters began to take on more defined forms, silhouettes of all the mirror's victims over the centuries. Sarah held Mary's diary tightly, its pages now glowing with a light of their own, as if the words written so long ago were awakening. She began to recite the counter-ritual, but not as Mary had written it. She reversed it, turning the words of invocation into an incantation of banishment. Time seemed to distort as she waited for Emily to return. Each second dragged on like hours, and the shadows around her grew denser and more threatening. The power of the mirror was growing, fueled by the approach of midnight. The battle for the salvation of the trapped souls was about to reach its climax, and Sarah knew that the next decisions would determine not only her fate, but that of all those who had been captured by the dark reflection over the years. The real test of her courage and determination was just beginning. Time seemed to compress and expand as Sarah held her position, reciting the inverted words of the ritual. The mist around her became denser and denser, and the voices of the trapped spirits echoed in a supernatural cacophony. Emily burst into the attic, carrying the original mirror with difficulty. Her face was pale and sweaty. Sarah, there's something wrong. The mirror, it's pulsating. Indeed, the surface of the mirror was emitting a reddish, pulsating glow, like an evil heart. When Emily positioned it next to the other mirrors in the attic, a wave of energy ran through all of them, making them vibrate in unison. Fools! Mary's voice thundered through Mrs. Peters. You have just completed the circle. The portal is now complete. Sarah realized her mistake too late. By bringing in the original mirror, they had inadvertently strengthened the connection between the worlds. The mirrored surfaces began to melt like wax, their shapes merging into a single gigantic portal. "Emily, the grimoire," Sarah shouted, still holding the journal. "There must be something we can use." As Emily frantically flipped through the old pages, Sarah noticed something in Mary's notes that she hadn't seen before. Among the smudges and scribbles, there was a pattern, a repeating symbol, always drawn with what looked like dried blood. "The blood is the key," Sarah murmured, understanding. "It's not about destroying the mirrors. It's about breaking the bond." Mrs. Peters' figure began to twitch unnaturally, her body arching at impossible angles. The mist that enveloped her took the definitive form of Mary Sullivan, but not as the desperate woman who had disappeared decades ago. This was a corrupted version, her black eyes like bottomless pits, in her white dress stained dark red. "So many years," the apparition spoke, her voice reverberating throughout the attic. "So many souls collected, and now, finally, the ritual can be completed." The clock began to chime, announcing the approach of midnight. Each chime made the mirrors pulse more strongly, and spectral figures began to emerge from the liquid surfaces, all the victims of the mirror over the centuries. Sarah looked at Emily, who still held the grimoire, and then at the diary in her own hands. In a moment of clarity, she understood what needed to be done. "Emily," she called out, her voice firm despite her fear. "Remember when we were children and we made that blood pact? We need to do it again. Now." Emily understood immediately. Together, they cut their palms with a piece of broken glass, their blood mixing. Sarah began to recite the counter-ritual again, but this time, Emily joined her, their voices intertwining in perfect harmony. The girl's blood dripped onto the pages of the diary and the grimoire, and something extraordinary happened. The written words began to glow with a golden light, and a wave of pure energy emanated from the books, colliding with the spectral mist. Mary screamed, a sound that didn't belong in this world. "No, what have you done?" "We broke the circle," Sarah replied, feeling an ancient force flow through her. Not with hatred or revenge, but with love and sacrifice. The portal began to destabilize, the mirrors cracking one after the other. The trapped souls began to free themselves, no longer corrupted by the evil power of the mirror, but purified by the girl's blood sacrifice. Mary's spectral form began to change, the darkness in her eyes giving way to a light of understanding. For a moment, Sarah saw the woman she had really been, a mother devastated by loss, manipulated by an ancient force that fed on her pain. "Thomas," Mary called out, her voice now soft and clear. A small luminous figure emerged from the fragments of the mirrors, the spirit of her son, finally free from a spectral prison. "Mama," the child's voice echoed through the attic, and Mary stretched out her arms, tears of joy streaming down her ethereal face. The final stroke of midnight rang out as mother and child were reunited in a luminous embrace. A wave of golden light exploded from the point of contact, sweeping through the attic and shattering all the mirrors simultaneously. Sarah and Emily hugged each other, shielding themselves from the rain of broken glass. When the light dimmed, they found Mrs. Peters unconscious but breathing normally. The mirrors were shattered, their surfaces reduced to glittering dust that floated in the air like tiny stars. On the floor, among the shards, Mary's diary and the grimoire had turned to ash, their function fulfilled. The cycle of horror that had lasted for generations was finally broken. In the days that followed, Sarah and Emily discovered that all the old mirrors in the city had shattered that night. People reported visions of golden lights and feelings of inexplicable peace. Gradually, the stories of the mysterious disappearances were forgotten, like nightmares that fade with the sunrise. Mrs. Peters didn't remember what had happened, but her face carried a serenity that hadn't been there before. As for the attic of Sarah's house, it had been transformed into an ordinary room, full of light and free of the shadows that had inhabited it for so long. The girls kept their secret, but the small scars on their palms remained as a reminder of the power of sacrifice and true friendship. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, they swore they saw golden reflections in the corner of their eyes. No longer a sign of terror, but a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, the light of love and courage can find its way through. And somewhere, beyond the veil between the worlds, a mother and her son finally found the peace they had sought for so long, free from the spectral chains that had kept them trapped in a dark reflection for generations. In the depths of eternal night, where not even the stars dared to shine, Quetzalcoatl contemplated the void that would one day be filled by humanity. The feathered serpent, whose scales shone with the brilliance of 1,000 suns and whose feathers danced with the grace of the heavenly winds, carried the weight of a divine mission in his heart. The 4 previous attempts at creation by his brother gods had failed, leaving only bones and bitter memories in the realm of the dead. Tezcatlipoca, his brother and eternal rival, watched from his smoking mirror, his enigmatic expression revealing both curiosity and skepticism. "Brother," his voice echoed across the divine plains. "Why do you insist on giving life to such imperfect creatures? Haven't you seen how previous attempts have ended in destruction?" But Quetzalcoatl knew something that the other gods didn't understand. As he glided through the skies in his serpentine form, his feathers reflecting the colors of the rainbow, he realized that the true power of creation lay not in perfection, but in the capacity for evolution and learning. On his journey to Mictlan, the realm of the dead, Quetzalcoatl met Mictlantecuhtli, the Lord of Death, guardian of the bones of past creations. The god of death, with his discarnate skull and spider-web robes, would not make the feathered serpent's mission any easier. "Why should I hand over the remains of previous failures?" he asked in his cavernous voice. It was then that Quetzalcoatl proposed the challenge. "Allow me to collect the bones, and in return, I promise to create beings who will honor both life and death, understanding the sacred cycle of existence." His words, full of wisdom and determination, echoed through the dark corridors of the underworld. Meanwhile, on the earthly plane, young Xochitl, one of the few survivors of the 4th era, wandered the desolate fields. Her existence was a mystery even to the gods, for she had survived the destruction that had decimated her generation. Her dark eyes held memories of a world that no longer existed, and in her heart burned the hope of a new dawn. Xochitl found shelter in an ancient cave, where cave paintings told the story of previous eras. There, she began to understand her role as a witness to the transition between worlds. Her hands traced the outlines of the figures on the wall, feeling the energy of the stories they told. In the celestial realm, other gods watched Quetzalcoatl's actions with renewed interest. Tlaloc, the god of rain, was preparing his sacred waters for when the time came to nourish the new creation. Calcayotlicu, mistress of lakes and rivers, wove streams of crystalline water that would one day flow through the earth. Quetzalcoatl's search for the sacred bones would not be easy. Mictlantecuhtli, always cunning, prepared 9 deadly challenges. The first was to cross a river of blood, where the souls of the dead tried to drag to the bottom any being who dared to cross it. With his divine wisdom, Quetzalcoatl transformed some of his feathers into a bridge of light, allowing him to cross the river without touching its scarlet waters. Each feather that touched the surface momentarily transformed the blood into crystal clear water, revealing the purifying power of the feathered serpent. Meanwhile, Xochitl began to dream of ancient voices whispering secrets about the coming creation. In his dreams, he saw a feathered serpent dancing among the stars, and his heart recognized in that vision the promise of a new beginning. The challenges continued, each one more difficult than the last. Quetzalcoatl faced cutting winds that could shatter mountains, crossed fields of sharp obsidian that tried to pierce his divine form, and withstood the freezing cold capable of paralyzing time itself. On his journey, the feathered serpent discovered that each obstacle was not just a test of strength or courage, but a lesson in the nature of the life he intended to create. Humanity would need to be as resilient as he was being, able to adapt and overcome adversity. In the sixth challenge, Quetzalcoatl found a mirror that reflected not his image, but the failures of previous creations. He saw beings who had succumbed to greed, others who had lost themselves in ignorance, and some who had been destroyed by their own arrogance. Each reflection was a warning and a lesson. Xochitl, in her cave, began to gather people like herself, scattered survivors who wandered aimlessly. Together, they began to create small rituals, celebrating the sun and the moon, keeping alive the flame of hope for a new world. The stories they shared at night, around small fires, were like seeds of a new culture waiting to blossom. Without knowing it, they were preparing the ground for the teachings that Quetzalcoatl would bring to future humanity. As Quetzalcoatl neared the end of his challenges, an ancient energy began to awaken. The skies shook with distant thunder, and the earth pulsed with a forgotten rhythm. It was as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment of new creation. The last challenge would be the hardest, facing their own fears and doubts. At the bottom of Mictlan, in a chamber made of black obsidian, Quetzalcoatl saw reflections of all possible futures, some glorious, others terrible. The choice to go ahead with the creation of humanity carried the weight of all these possibilities. It was at this moment that the true nature of his mission was revealed. The creation of humanity would not just be an act of divine power, but an act of love and faith in the potential of what was to come. With this understanding, Quetzalcoatl crossed the last chamber, finally reaching the sacred bones. Mictlantecuhtli, impressed by the perseverance and wisdom shown, allowed Quetzalcoatl to collect the bones, but not without a final warning. What you create with these bones will carry both the memory of failure and the seed of hope. Choose wisely how you shape your essence. With the sacred bones in his possession, Quetzalcoatl began his ascent back to the upper world, where he would begin the real work of giving life to the new humanity. In his mind, he was already visualizing the knowledge he would share, the art of growing corn, the secrets of the stars, the mathematics that explains the cycles of nature, and the medicine that heals body and spirit. With the sacred bones in his hands, Quetzalcoatl emerged from the Mictlan, his feathers glowing with renewed intensity. The weight of the ancestral bones was not only physical, but spiritual, carrying with them the memories and experiences of previous creations. As it ascended, tiny fragments of light escaped from between its feathers, like shooting stars announcing the dawn of a new era. Xochitl and his small group of survivors observed the luminous phenomenon in the sky with wonder and amazement. The dancing lights seemed to form patterns, telling ancient stories in a language that their hearts, but not their minds, could understand. An old woman among them, called Lali, recognized the signs. "It's the return of the feathered serpent," she whispered, her wrinkled eyes fixed on the celestial spectacle. The ancients spoke of this moment, when the divine and the earthly would meet again. On the celestial plane, Quetzalcoatl was preparing the ritual of creation. His divine blood, precious and powerful, would be the catalyst that would transform the inert bones into pulsating life. Each drop that fell on the ancestral bones carried not only vital power, but also wisdom and purpose. Tezcatlipoca, still skeptical, but now intrigued, approached his brother. "I see you've made the bones," he observed, his smoky mirror reflecting the process of creation. "But how do you intend to avoid the mistakes of the past?" Quetzalcoatl, without interrupting his sacred work, replied wisely. "The mistakes of the past will be the lessons of the future. This time, we won't just create bodies, we'll plant seeds of knowledge and understanding." Meanwhile, on the Earth's surface, subtle changes were beginning to take place. The previously barren soil was beginning to show signs of life. Tiny green shoots emerged from the earth, and the air carried a different scent, as if nature itself was preparing to welcome its new guardians. Xochitl, guided by an inexplicable impulse, led her group to a valley surrounded by ancient mountains. There, they found a spring of crystalline water flowing from the earth, as if Calcayatlicu was preparing the way for what was to come. There, they began to build a small settlement. Their calloused hands erected simple shelters, while their hearts were filled with inexplicable hope. Silali taught the younger ones the old songs, keeping alive the memory of a time that would soon be reborn. On the divine plane, the process of creation continued. Every bone bathed in the blood of Quetzalcoatl began to pulsate with a life of its own. First came the men, their bodies formed from the essence of the earth and the spirit of the wind. Then came the women, born of the power of water and the heat of the sun. But this creation was different from the previous ones. Quetzalcoatl not only gave physical form to the new beings, but also imbued them with special abilities. In their minds, he planted the seeds of knowledge that would blossom with time and dedication. Look, he said to the other gods who had now gathered to witness the birth of the fifth humanity. These are not just receptacles of our will, but carriers of divine potential. The first men and women opened their eyes to a world that awaited them. Their bodies, still covered in the glow of divine blood, shone like polished copper under the rising sun. In their eyes shone a curiosity that none of the previous creations had ever shown. Quetzalcoatl watched them with the pride of a creator and the concern of a mentor. He knew that his work had only just begun. These new beings would need guidance, knowledge, and above all, an understanding of their place in the great cycle of existence. In the valley where Xochitl and his group settled, the signs of change intensified. The sky took on more vibrant colors, and the winds brought melodies never heard before. The stars themselves seemed to rearrange themselves in the firmament, forming new patterns that told the story of creation in progress. Citlali, in her ancestral wisdom, began to interpret these signs. Her words, shared around the night fires, prepared the survivors for the encounter with the new humanity that was about to emerge. "We will be the bridges," she declared, "between what was and what will be. Our memory will serve as a guide for those who are coming." On the divine plane, Quetzalcoatl continued his meticulous work. Each new being received not only life, but also unique gifts. Some were born with an affinity for understanding plant cycles, others with the ability to read the patterns of the stars, and some with the gift of healing and comfort. The other gods, initially skeptical, began to see the wisdom in Quetzalcoatl's plan. Tlaloc prepared the rains that would nourish the first crops, while Zacaquetzal, goddess of the arts and love, wove the first dreams that would inspire human creativity. As more and more beings came to life, a new energy filled the universe. It was as if each element, earth, water, fire, and air, found a new balance, a long-lost harmony. The new humans, different from their predecessor creations, were born with a natural connection to these elements. Xochitl, sensing the changes in the air, began to prepare his group for the encounter with the newly created. Under his guidance, they built a simple temple in the center of the valley, a place where the divine and the earthly could meet. The moment of the meeting between the survivors and the new humanity was approaching, and with it, the promise of a new chapter in the history of the world. Quetzalcoatl, watching from his heavenly plane, knew that this meeting would be crucial for the future he envisioned. The meeting between the two groups was about to take place. Under Quetzalcoatl's watchful eye, the first men and women of the new creation began their journey towards the valley where Xochitl and his companions were waiting. The air vibrated with an ancient and new energy at the same time, as if the very fabric of reality was adjusting to this unique convergence. Citlali, the elder, gathered everyone around the newly built temple. Her trembling hands lit sacred herbs, whose sweet scent spread through the morning air. "They come with the knowledge of the gods in their hearts," she said, "but they will need our memories to understand who they are." The new beings, guided by an instinct implanted by their creator, moved with grace and purpose. Their bodies still glowed softly with the remnants of Quetzalcoatl's divine blood, and their eyes carried an ancient wisdom mixed with childlike curiosity. At the head of the group walked a woman called Mayayul, whose footsteps made flowers bloom wherever she went. Xochitl, watching from the top of a hill, felt his heart race as he saw the first signs of the approach. The stories he had kept for so long, the memories of ages gone by, seemed to throb in his chest, eager to be shared. On the celestial plane, Quetzalcoatl continued his work, now focused on weaving the invisible threads that would connect the two groups. Each new being he created carried not only innate knowledge, but also the ability to learn from those who came before. It was a delicate dance between the divine and the earthly, between the new and the old. The first meeting took place at sunrise. Mayahul, leading the newly created, stopped in front of Xochitl. For a moment, they just looked at each other, recognizing each other as different parts of the same story. It was Citlali who broke the silence, singing an ancient song of welcome that made the mountains reverberate with its melody. The new beings brought with them the gifts that Quetzalcoatl had given them. A man called Tlalixin showed them how to read cloud patterns to predict rain. A young woman called Zacapili revealed the secret of the medicinal plants that grew hidden among the rocks. Each piece of knowledge shared was like a bridge being built between the two worlds. In return, the survivors offered something equally precious, the living memory of past eras. Xochitl told of the 4 previous creations, of the mistakes and lessons learned. His words were like seeds planted in fertile soil, ready to blossom in the consciousness of the new humanity. Tezcatlipoca, watching through his smoking mirror, began to understand the true genius of his brother's plan. It's not just a new creation, he muttered to himself. It's a synthesis, a harmony between the past and the future. The next few days were filled with intense learning and exchange. The newly created, although born with divine knowledge, discovered that there was much to learn from the earthly experience of the survivors. They learned about resilience from Xochitl, about ancestral wisdom from Citlali, about the importance of community from everyone else. In the valley, the small settlement began to transform. New dwellings sprang up, built with techniques that combined the celestial knowledge of the newcomers with the practical experience of the survivors. Gardens were planted following the sacred patterns taught by Quetzalcoatl, but adapted to the local wisdom about the soil and the seasons. Mayahul and Xochitl became inseparable partners in the task of building bridges between the two groups. Together, they developed new rituals that honored both divine teachings and earthly memory. Their voices joined in songs that told the complete story of humanity, from the first attempts to the present moment of renewal. Quetzalcoatl, satisfied with the progress, began to prepare his last teachings. He knew that he would soon have to leave for the East, but first, he needed to ensure that humanity had all the tools it needed to prosper. Through dreams and visions, he shared his knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and the sacred arts. Citlali, realizing that her role as guardian of ancient memory was coming to an end, began training the younger members of both groups in the arts of preserving history. Our words are seeds, she taught, planted in the heart of time, blossoming in future generations. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, a new culture began to emerge in the valley. It was neither entirely divine nor entirely earthly, but a harmonious fusion of both. The rituals incorporated both the mathematical precision of heavenly teachings and the intuitive wisdom of human experience. Tezcatlipoca, who had initially doubted the success of this creation, now regularly visited the valley through the reflection of his mirror. He watched with growing interest as this new humanity learned to balance divine knowledge with earthly experience, ancient wisdom with innovation. The other gods also began to contribute more actively. Tlaloc sent gentle rains to nourish the first crops, while Calcalicu blessed the rivers that cut through the valley. Each divine intervention was received with gratitude and understanding by a humanity that now understood its place in the great cycle of existence. In the heart of the valley, the simple temple that Xochitl and his companions had built became a center of learning and celebration. There, divine and earthly knowledge met and multiplied, creating new ways of understanding and interacting with the world. As the new civilization flourished in the valley, Quetzalcoatl realized that the moment of his departure was approaching. From high in the heavens, he watched with satisfaction as his teachings were not only learned, but transformed and enriched by the unique union between the newcomers and the survivors. Maya Yule had become a natural leader, her connection with the earth and the plants inspiring others to develop their own gifts. Under her guidance, vast fields of golden corn stretched across the valley, cultivated with techniques that blended divine knowledge with the practical experience of the survivors. Xochitl, for his part, established a school of memory, where the stories of past ages were preserved through paintings, songs, and ritual dances. His students learned not only to remember, but to understand the lessons contained in each ancient narrative. It was during one of these classes that a young man called Tonuryu had a vision. While Xochitl was telling him about the previous creations, he clearly saw the image of Quetzalcoatl heading east, his bright feathers leaving a trail of light in the sky. The sight deeply disturbed him. "The feathered serpent will be leaving soon," he announced, his voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. The silence that followed was thick as morning mist, each person present sensing the truth in the young man's words. Seat Lali, who was present, nodded slowly. "Yes, the stars have spoken about it. It's part of the cycle. The master must leave so that the disciples can grow up on their own." The news spread through the valley like wind through corn leaves. Some were apprehensive, fearing that without the direct presence of their creator, they might repeat the mistakes of previous humanities. Others understood that this was a necessary test of their maturity. Maya Yule assembled a council of the wisest, including members of both the newly created and the survivors. "We need to prepare," she declared, "not just for his departure, but to keep his teachings alive." Meanwhile, on the celestial plane, Quetzalcoatl was preparing his last gifts for humanity. He created sacred codices in which he recorded knowledge about celestial cycles, plant medicine, and the principles of universal harmony. Each page was imbued with its own divine essence, ensuring that the knowledge remained alive and evolving. Tezcatlipoca, observing his brother's preparations, approached with a question: "Why leave now, when your creation is still so young?" "Because they need to learn to walk on their own," replied Quetzalcoatl. "The true test of a master is not how much his disciples depend on him, but how they thrive in his absence." In the valley, Xochitl and Maya Yule worked tirelessly to prepare the community. They established a teaching system where each person with a specific gift was responsible for passing on their knowledge to a group of apprentices. In this way, wisdom would be preserved and expanded through the generations. Tonuryu, inspired by his vision, began to study the patterns of the stars with renewed intensity. Together with other young men, he built an observatory on top of a hill where they mapped the celestial movements and recorded their discoveries in carefully crafted codices. Seat Lali, sensing that his own time of departure was approaching, intensified his teachings on sacred rituals. "The connection with the divine," she explained, "does not depend on the physical presence of the gods, but on our ability to keep the sacred flame alive in our hearts." As the moment of Quetzalcoatl's departure approached, a subtle transformation began to take place in the valley. People began to trust more in their own abilities, discovering that the divine knowledge they had received was like a seed that now blossomed in unique ways in each person. Maya Yule discovered that the plants responded not only to the technical knowledge he had received, but also to his own intuition and connection with the earth. Under his care, new varieties of medicinal plants began to emerge, combining known properties in innovative ways. Xochitl realized that the stories he told were not just records of the past, but living tools that help people understand their present and shape their future. Each ancient narrative took on new meanings as it was interpreted through the experiences of the new humanity. The other gods, observing these transformations, began to understand the true nature of Quetzalcoatl's plan. It wasn't just about creating a new humanity, but about establishing a self-sustaining cycle of spiritual evolution and growth. Tlaloc, impressed by the way humans have learned to work in harmony with their elements, began to respond more readily to their prayers and rituals. The rains came at the right time, nourishing not only the crops, but also the understanding of the connection between heaven and earth. In the heart of the valley, the simple temple had been transformed into a complex of learning and celebration. Different areas were dedicated to the study of astronomy, medicine, agriculture, and the arts. each sacred space reflected the unique fusion of divine knowledge and human experience. Finally, the day of Quetzalcoatl's departure arrived. The valley awoke to a different light, as if the sun itself were hesitating on its way across the sky. The people gathered spontaneously in the central temple, their hearts heavy with the expectation of the imminent farewell. Mayhul and Xochitl led the preparations for the farewell ritual. Copal incense spiraled through the air, while drums set a rhythm that echoed the very pulse of the earth. Citlali, now an even more respected figure, guided the youngsters in the sacred chants that would cross the dimensions between the earthly and the divine. On the celestial plane, Quetzalcoatl was making his own preparations. His feathers shone with an intensity that dazzled even the stars, and his serpentine body formed patterns in the sky that astronomers would study for generations. Tezcatlipoca, its eternal counterpoint, watched in respectful silence. Tonatiuh, from the top of his observatory, recorded every movement in the heavens. His codices now contain not only astronomical observations, but also prophecies about the promised return of the feathered serpent. The stars show cycles, he explained to the other scholars, and every cycle promises a return. Quetzalcoatl's descent into the valley was spectacular. His celestial body created a multicolored aurora that bathed the entire region in prismatic light. The plants bowed towards him, and even the wildest animals emerged from their hiding places to witness the moment. In front of the gathered crowd, Quetzalcoatl took on a form closer to human understanding, still divine, but less dazzling. His voice, when he spoke, was like ancient music carried by distant winds. My children, the time has come for you to follow your own paths. The next words were engraved not only in the codices, but in the hearts of every person present. You carry within you both my blood and your own essence. The knowledge I have shared is not a chain that binds you, but wings that will allow you to fly. Mayhul stepped forward, offering Quetzalcoatl a garland made of flowers that had been born from his own footsteps. Father Creator, she said, her voice firm despite her emotion, how will we know if we are following the right path? The feathered serpent's reply was accompanied by a smile that lit up the valley. The right path is the one you create by walking with wisdom and compassion. Don't just try to imitate my steps, but learn to dance your own dance. Xochitl, who had kept the memories of so many ages, then understood something profound. This was no ordinary farewell, but a transformation. Each person present was now a guardian, not only of the knowledge received, but of the potential to create new knowledge. Quetzalcoatl continued his final teachings. True wisdom does not lie in having all the answers, but in knowing how to ask the right questions. The universe is a mystery that reveals itself to those who keep their hearts open and their minds curious. Citlali, sensing that this moment would echo through the ages, began an ancient chant that spoke of cycles and returns. Other voices joined in, creating a harmony that seemed to weave the very threads of fate. Before leaving, Quetzalcoatl performed one last creative act. With a flick of his feathers, he created a sacred garden in the center of the valley, where each plant contained a different lesson, each flower a secret of the universe. This will be a meeting place between the divine and the earthly, he explained, where they can always renew their connection with the sacred. The moment of departure itself was marked by an extraordinary transformation. Quetzalcoatl rose into the sky, his serpentine body expanding until it seemed to embrace the entire eastern horizon. His feathers fell gently, each one shining like a star before dissolving into thin air. Tonatiuh, watching from his post, took note of how the departed god left a trail in the sky that formed a specific pattern, a celestial map that could be used to predict his return. He left us clues, he whispered, to keep hope alive. In the days following his departure, the community discovered that Quetzalcoatl's teachings continued to reveal themselves in new ways. Mayhul noticed that the plants in the sacred garden were subtly changing, adapting to people's needs. Xochitl found new meanings in the old stories, as if each narrative were a living thing that grew over time. Quetzalcoatl's promise of return was not just a prophecy for the future, but a constant reminder that the divine was never truly absent. Every dawn brought new discoveries. Every dusk, new reflections. Humanity had learned not just to survive, but to evolve. The legacy of the feathered serpent lived on not just in the codices and rituals, but in the very essence of a civilization that flourished in the valley. Subsequent generations would continue to develop the arts, sciences, and philosophies he had introduced, always finding new meanings and applications for the ancestral teachings. And so, as Quetzalcoatl traveled east, his creation continued to grow and transform, proving that the true miracle was not just in the act of creation, but in the infinite capacity for evolution and renewal that had been planted in the heart of every human being. Night fell heavily on the road that snaked between the hills of the interior of Sao Paulo. Miguel adjusted the rearview mirror, tried to improve visibility through the windshield, which had been battered by the torrential rain. The headlights of his '89 Chevette could barely cut through the darkness that grew thicker with every kilometer. As an ab driver for 3 years, he was used to the nighttime weather, but this particular night had something different about it, a dense atmosphere that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The radio buzzed, alternating between static and fragmented snippets of old songs. Miguel tried to tune into a station, but gave up after a few unsuccessful attempts. The silence inside the car was broken only by the monotonous noise of the windshield wipers and the drumming of the rain on the metal roofs. His thoughts wandered between overdue bills and worrying about his sick mother, reasons that made him accept late-night races, even in adverse weather conditions like that. He was returning from a run in a remote area when his eyes caught sight of a white figure on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was just a reflection of the rain in the headlights, but as he got closer, the silhouette became more defined. It was a young woman, dressed entirely in white, in a long, old-fashioned dress that seemed inappropriate for the storm. Her raised arm signaled for a ride. Miguel hesitated for a moment. His rational mind told him to keep going. After all, stopping for strangers on a deserted road in the middle of the night was a recipe for trouble. But something deep inside him compelled him to stop. Perhaps it was the girl's helpless expression, or perhaps the thought that it could be his own sister in that situation. He braked gently, pulling the car over onto the muddy shoulder. The young woman climbed into the back seat with an ethereal grace, her movements as silent as a breeze. Miguel noticed through the rearview mirror that she appeared to be around 20, with delicate features and very pale skin. Her long black hair was inexplicably dry, despite the torrential rain. "Good evening, ma'am. Where are you going?" Miguel asked, trying to maintain a professional tone, although a strange feeling was beginning to form in his stomach. The answer came in an almost inaudible whisper. "Rua das Margaritas, 237, Villa Santo Antonio." His voice had a distant quality, as if it came from very far away. Miguel knew the address. It was in an old district of the city, about 40 minutes away. He turned on the meter out of habit, although something told him that this would be no ordinary ride. The silence that followed was dense, almost palpable. He tried to strike up a conversation a few times, but the passenger would only respond with monosyllables when she answered at all. As he drove, Miguel began to notice disturbing details. The seat where the girl was sitting showed no sign of dampness, despite the torrential rain outside. Through the rearview mirror, his attempts to observe her were thwarted by a kind of mist that seemed to envelop her figure. The temperature inside the car had dropped considerably, to the point where her breath formed small clouds of condensation. The deserted streets of the city looked different that night, as if they had been transported to another era. The old houses of Villa Santo Antonio, with their Art Deco facades and manicured gardens, emanated a melancholy aura under the yellowish light of the street lamps. The rain had subsided to a fine, persistent drizzle. As he approached number 237, Miguel felt a shiver run down his spine. The house was an old but well-kept building with a front garden full of daisies, unusual for that time of year. A yellowish light shone through the lacy curtains in the living room, suggesting that someone was awake at that late hour. "We're here, ma'am," announced Miguel, turning to the back seat. The words died in his throat, when he realized he was alone in the car. The seat was completely dry, with no sign that anyone had been there moments before. His heart raced and a wave of icy dread ran through his body. With trembling hands, Miguel turned off the car and spent a few minutes trying to process what had happened. His rational mind searched for logical explanations, but nothing made sense. Driven by a curiosity that overcame his fear, he decided to knock on the door of the house. He needed to understand, he needed answers that would make sense of that surreal night. As he walked along the stone path in the garden, he noticed that the daisies seemed to glow supernaturally in the moonlight that was now breaking through the clouds. The sound of his footsteps on the wet gravel echoed eerily in the silence of the night. His hand hesitated for a moment before ringing the ancient bronze bell. The melodious sound of the bell reverberated through the house, and a few moments later, footsteps approached the door. Miguel felt his heart speed up even more when the door opened, revealing an elderly man with white hair and a tired but kind expression. Next to him, an equally elderly woman looked at him with curious and apprehensive eyes. At that moment, Miguel didn't know that he was about to discover a story that would change his life forever. A story of love, loss, and mysteries that transcended human understanding. What had begun as just another night at work would turn into a journey that would force him to question everything he believed about reality and the supernatural. "Good evening. Sorry to bother you so late," Miguel began, his voice betraying his nervousness. "I'm an app driver and, well, I've just brought a young woman to this address, but his voice faltered, unsure of how to explain something he didn't even understand. The elderly couple exchanged a meaningful glance, as if those words were awakening long-held memories. The lady stepped forward, her eyes watering with sudden tears. "Please come in," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think we need to talk." Miguel was led into a living room that seemed frozen in time. Old, well-preserved furniture, black and white photos on the walls, and a pendulum clock that ticked solemnly. The man, who introduced himself as Alberto, indicated an armchair for Miguel to sit in, while his wife, Dona Clara, went to prepare some tea. "How was she dressed?" asked Alberto, his voice carrying a weight that Miguel couldn't fully understand. "A long white dress. It looked old," Miguel replied, noticing how the gentleman's hands were trembling slightly. "She had long black hair and very pale skin." Dona Clara returned with a tray of tea, silent tears streaming down her wrinkled face. In her trembling hands, she held a picture frame which she handed to Miguel. The photograph showed exactly the same young woman who had been in his car moments before, smiling next to an old car, wearing the same white dress. "This was our daughter, Helena," said Dona Clara, taking a seat next to her husband. "She died exactly 40 years ago, on that same road where you found her today." Miguel felt a shiver run down his spine as the elderly people began to tell the story. Helena was a young teacher, adored by her students and known for her kindness. On that fateful night in 1983, she was returning from a graduation party for her students when her car broke down during a storm similar to the one that night. She tried to get help in the rain. Alberto continued, his voice breaking. "A truck. The driver said he didn't see her in time." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Since then, especially on nights of heavy rain, we've had visitors like you. Drivers who find you in the same place, trying to get home." Miguel listened attentively, his cup of tea forgotten in his hands. The supernatural stories his grandmother used to tell him as a child seemed to take on a new dimension of reality. But why does she keep coming back? Mrs. Clara stood up and walked over to a bookcase, returning with a carved wind box. Inside were letters, photos, and a diary. Helena was engaged, she explained, showing a photo of a smiling young man in military uniform. Carlos left to serve abroad a week before the accident. She never received his last letter. The letter in question, yellowed by time but carefully preserved, was still unopened. Carlos never heard about Helena's accident. He himself died on duty a few weeks later. The double tragedy had devastated both families. "We believe she's still looking for a way home because there's something unfinished," said Alberto, looking thoughtfully at the photos. "Each person who brings her here is like an attempt to complete her last journey." Miguel noticed that his hands had stopped shaking. The initial fear had been replaced by a deep melancholy and compassion. His grandmother's stories about lost souls had taken on a new meaning. They weren't just tales to scare children, but reflections of real pain, of broken loves and goodbyes that never happened. The pendulum clock struck 3, making Michael realize how much time had passed. The rain outside had stopped completely, leaving only the silence of dawn. Donna Clara insisted on showing more photos of Helena, her training, her first days as a teacher, happy times with Carlos. "Have you tried opening the letter?" asked Miguel, looking at the sealed envelope on the table. "We didn't have the courage," replied Donna Clara. "We always felt it wasn't our right. It belongs to Helena." At that moment, a gentle breeze blew through the room, making the curtains dance slightly, even though all the windows were closed. The picture frame with Helena's photo trembled on the table, and for a moment, Miguel could have sworn he felt that same chill he had experienced in the car. "She's here," whispered Donna Clara, her hands clasping her husband's. "She always comes back when we talk about her." Miguel watched in fascination as the photos on the table moved slightly, as if someone invisible was watching them. The envelope of the unopened letter shook, sliding a few centimeters across the polished surface of the table. It was as if the very air in the room had become denser, charged with a presence that could not be seen, but could be felt by everyone present. The atmosphere in the old room became even denser when the letter began to move on its own. Miguel, Alberto, and Donna Clara watched in reverential silence as the envelope slowly slid across the table, stopping near the edge. Helena's invisible presence was almost tangible in the air. "Maybe," Miguel began hesitantly, "maybe it's time to open the letter." "If Helena is here," he didn't complete the sentence, but everyone understood the implicit meaning. Donna Clara looked at her husband, who nodded slightly. With trembling hands, she picked up the yellowed envelope. "Helena, my child," her voice was soft, motherly. "If you're here, give us a sign if we should open it." The curtains swung tighter, and one of the photos on the table fell, revealing a picture of Helena and Carlos together, smiling in front of the school where she taught. The signal seemed clear, taking extreme care not to damage the envelope that had been preserved for 4 decades. Donna Clara opened the letter. The paper was surprisingly well preserved, Carlos' firm handwriting still legible after all these years. Miguel noticed that his own hands were sweating as the lady began to read aloud. "My dear Helena, I hope this letter finds you well. The nights here are long and cold, but thinking of you warms my heart. I have news that I couldn't wait for. I got my transfer back. When this letter arrives, it will only be 2 weeks before we meet again. I can't stop thinking about our future together. The house we saw on Rua das Margaritas will be perfect. I can already imagine our children running around the garden while you grow your favorite flowers. I've saved every penny of my salary to put down the deposit. It will be our first great achievement together. The wedding ring I've chosen is with me, waiting for the moment to shine on your finger. I know we agreed to wait a little longer, but I can't put it off any longer. When I get back, I want us to get married right away. Life is too short to put off happiness. With all my love, Carlos." The silence that followed the reading was interrupted only by the muffled sound of Donna Clara's sobs. The temperature in the room dropped even more, and Miguel could see his own breath forming little clouds in the air. The photographs on the table began to shake more intensely. "The house," Alberto said suddenly, his voice choked. "This house, we bought it after the accident. It was their dream." Miguel looked around with new eyes, realizing that he was sitting in the house that should have been the young couple's happy home. The daisy garden outside, so well tended even after so many years, was a silent tribute to their lost daughter. A soft sound, like a distant sigh, echoed through the room. The curtains moved again, this time as if someone was walking through them. Miguel felt a presence pass through him. Not a frightening chill, but a sense of deep melancholy. "She had to know," whispered Donna Clara, clutching the letter to her chest. "All these years, she kept coming back because she didn't know Carlos was coming back to her." Miguel remembered the young woman in her car, her silence in her distant expression. Now he understood. It wasn't just a lost soul trying to get home. It was a bride waiting for her love to return, trapped in an eternal cycle of waiting. The pendulum clock began to play a soft melody, an old lullaby that filled the room with its melancholy notes. Alberto explained in a choked voice that it was Helena's favorite song, and that the clock had never chimed since the day of the accident. "I think she's saying goodbye," said Alberto, hugging his wife. "She's finally understood that Carlos is left too, that they can meet somewhere else." The photograph stopped shaking, and the temperature gradually began to normalize. The presence that had once been so palpable faded away, leaving behind only a faint scent of daisies in the air. Miguel stayed with the couple until dawn, listening to stories about Helena and Carlos, about their dreams and interrupted plans. When the first rays of sunlight began to penetrate through the windows, he realized that he had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just an encounter with the supernatural, but a moment of resolution, of peace found after decades of waiting. Outside, the daisy garden glistened with the morning dew, each flower looking more alive and vibrant than before. Miguel was sure that Helena would never come back to hitchhike on rainy nights again. Her last journey was finally complete. In the days that followed that extraordinary night, Miguel couldn't stop thinking about Helena and her story. The encounter with the supernatural had changed something fundamental in his perspective on life and death. During his nightly runs, he often found himself looking through the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that ethereal figure in the white dress again. A week after the incident, Miguel decided to visit the house in Rua das Margaritas again. This time, he arrived during the day, carrying a small bouquet of fresh daisies. Dona Clara welcomed him with a warm smile, as if she had been expecting his return. The house looked different in the daylight, less mysterious, but still imbued with a peculiar serenity. "Since that night," began Dona Clara as she served coffee in the same room where they had read the letter, "things have changed around here. It's as if a weight has been lifted." She paused, looking thoughtfully out of the window at the garden. "No other drivers have turned up reporting having found Helena." Miguel noticed that the old photographs were still on the table, but now they seemed to tell a different story. No longer one of sadness and waiting, but of love that transcended time. Alberto joined them, bringing a box of souvenirs that hadn't been shown the night before. "We found this yesterday," said Alberto, pulling out a notebook with a faded blue cover. "It's Helena's diary. We never had the courage to read it before, but now," his voice faltered for a moment, "now it feels right." The diary revealed a Helena very different from the silent apparition Miguel had encountered. The pages were full of dreams, plans, and little everyday joys. She wrote about her students with affection, about Carlos' letters with youthful love, and about the future she imagined in that same house where they were now. "Look at this," said Dona Clara, pointing to a particular entry. It was written the day before the accident. Helena's delicate handwriting filled the page. "Tomorrow is my little one's graduation. After the party, I'm going to go to church and light a candle, asking for protection for Carlos. He's only a few days away. I can already feel my heart beating faster just thinking about it. The daisies in the garden of our future home look beautiful. I went there today. It would be the perfect place to start our life together." Miguel felt a lump in his throat. The young teacher had no idea that this would be her last day, that she would never achieve the dreams described in those pages. However, there was something beautiful and tragic about the fact that her spirit had chosen exactly that house, the symbol of her unfulfilled dreams, as the end point of her earthly journey. "We found this too," Alberto said, pulling out a different yellowed envelope from Carlos' letter. It was a letter that Helena had started writing to him, but never finished. The interrupted words in the middle of the page were a silent testimony to interrupted plans. "My love, I can't wait to tell you in person, but I can't keep this secret. I took a test today and..." The silence that followed was heavy. Mrs. Clara covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. Miguel understood the meaning of those unfinished words. Helena was pregnant when she died, taking with her not only her own dreams, but also a life that had barely begun. "She never told anyone," whispered Dona Clara, her voice embittered. "All these years, and we never knew." The daisy garden, visible through the window, seemed to shine with a different light in the afternoon sun. Miguel realized that those flowers weren't just a tribute to Helena's memory. They were a living testimony to dreams that, although interrupted, had never completely died. Alberto stood up slowly and walked over to an old record player in the corner of the room. Carefully, he put on a record and a soft melody filled the room. The same music that the pendulum clock had played that night. It was the song they danced when they got engaged, he explained. Helena said it would be the first song they danced to at their wedding. As the music played, Miguel noticed something extraordinary. The daisies in the garden seemed to move in a gentle dance, even though there was no wind. For a brief moment, he had the impression of seeing two translucent figures dancing among the flowers, one in a white dress and the other in military uniform. "Did you see?" he began, but stopped when he saw the serene smiles on the faces of the elderly couple. They had seen it too. It was no longer an apparition of sadness or farewell, but a glimpse of a love that had found its way into eternity. The days turned into weeks, and Miguel continued his regular visits to Helena's parents' house. Something inexplicable kept him connected to that story, to that family that fate had placed in his path. Afternoons spent with Alberto and Dona Clara became a comforting ritual, filled with stories of the past and a silent shared understanding of things that exist beyond our comprehension. On one of these visits, while helping Dona Clara organize old photographs, Miguel found something interesting at the bottom of a dusty box, an old newspaper scrapbook. The yellowed headlines told not only about Helena's accident, but also about other similar stories over the years. Drivers reporting encounters with a mysterious woman in white on the same road. "There were so many," said Dona Clara, running her fingers gently over the clippings. "Each one brought a little piece of her back home. But you, Miguel, were different. You helped our daughter find peace." Miguel reflected on how that rainy night had changed his life. His night runs now carried a new meaning. Each passenger could have their own story, their own pain and undisclosed secrets. He had become more attentive, more compassionate, as if Helena had taught him a silent lesson about empathy and human connection. Alberto, who was tending the garden, entered the room with some freshly picked daisies. "You know," he began, placing the flowers in a vase. "Since that night, the daisies have never wilted. It's as if they're always in full bloom, no matter the season." The phenomenon of the eternally blooming daisies became a bit of a local mystery. Neighbors began to notice, and soon the story of the house on Rua das Daisadas began to circulate around town. Not as a horror story about a ghost bride, but as a love story that transcended death itself. Miguel decided to do something special. With the help of other app drivers, he organized a small celebration in memory of Helena and Carlos. On a clear night with a full moon, exactly 1 month after their supernatural encounter, a group of people gathered in the garden of the house. Among them were Helena's former pupils, now elderly, who still had fond memories of their young teacher. Mrs. Clara brought Helena's diary and read some passages aloud. The young teacher's words, full of hope and love, echoed through the garden lit by small lanterns. Alberto shared stories about how Helena and Carlos met, about their plans for the future, about the love that not even death could erase. During the impromptu ceremony, something extraordinary happened. The music playing on the old record player, the same one Helena and Carlos danced to at their engagement, began to sound clearer, more alive. The daisies in the garden seemed to pulsate with a light of their own, and a gentle breeze carried an intense scent of flowers. Everyone present felt it. It was no longer a melancholy or frightening presence, but something welcoming, like a warm farewell hug. Some swore they saw, for a brief moment, the reflection of a young couple dancing among the flowers, their translucent figures shining in the moonlight. Miguel watched as one of Helena's former students approached Dona Clara with an old box. "I found this among my mother's things," she said, moved. Inside was a photograph that nobody knew about. Helena smiling in front of her classroom, one hand discreetly resting on her belly, her secret kept in a radiant smile. The discovery of this last photograph brought a feeling of completeness. The circle was closing, not with sadness, but with acceptance and understanding. Helena and Carlos' story, although tragic, had touched and transformed countless lives over the decades. In the months that followed, Miguel continued his work as a driver, but something had fundamentally changed in his outlook. Every passenger who got into his car was a potential story. Every night wrought a possibility for meaningful encounters. The experience with Helena taught him that some connections transcend time and death itself. Alberto and Dona Clara transformed the house into a small memorial. One of the rooms was dedicated to telling the story of Helena and Carlos, with photographs, letters, and a carefully preserved diary. The Daisy Garden became a place of reflection and hope, where people came to find comfort and, occasionally, to share their own stories of love and loss. One quiet afternoon, while Miguel was helping to organize the memorial, Dona Clara handed him something special, the old wedding ring that Carlos had never had the chance to give Helena. "We want you to have this," she said softly. "You've become part of this story, part of our family." Miguel accepted the ring with reverence, understanding that it wasn't just an object, but a symbol of a story that would live on through the people who knew and shared it. The road where it all began was no longer a place of tragedy, but a meeting point between two worlds, where love proved stronger than death itself. The daisies continue to bloom eternally in the garden of House 237, and on full moon nights, passers-by can sometimes hear a soft melody, the music of two hearts that have finally found their way to each other, dancing eternally among the flowers that never wither. The wind howled through the frozen trees as Sarah Thompson adjusted her scarf, observing the white expanse that stretched out in front of her. The small town of Pine Creek, Montana, was completely isolated by the worst blizzard in 50 years. As the community doctor, she knew that the next few weeks would be crucial for the survival of the 300 inhabitants. The emergency radio crackled in the makeshift clinic that Sarah kept in her house. Sheriff Mike Davidson's voice sounded choppy. "Sarah, we need you at the outpost. We found something." The hesitation in his voice made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Sarah grabbed her medical bag and put on her heaviest coat. As she walked through the deep snow, her thoughts turned to the events of the last few weeks. First, the storm that blocked all the roads. Then the communication lines went down. Finally, supplies began to run low. It was as if winter was trying to swallow Pine Creek whole. At the outpost, an old hunting cabin converted into a rescue station, Sarah met Mike and two of the local rangers, brothers John and Peter Redwood, members of the Algonquin tribe who had lived in the area for generations. The men's grave countenances immediately worried her. "It's Jim Cooper," said Mike, leading her to a makeshift stretcher. "We found him wandering in the woods, almost frozen. But there's something wrong, Sarah. Something very wrong." Jim Cooper was one of the most experienced hunters in the region. He knew those mountains like the back of his hand. Seeing him there, shivering and mumbling incoherently, was disturbing. His clothes were torn and stained with something that Sarah preferred not to identify immediately. While examining Jim, John Redwood approached, his voice low and tense. Was he alone? The question seemed strange until Sarah remembered that Jim had gone hunting with his partner, Bill Matthews, 3 days ago. "Where is Bill?" Sarah asked Jim gently, who just shook his head, his wide eyes fixed on a distant point. "Hungry," he whispered at last. "So hungry." Peter Redwood exchanged a meaningful glance with his brother. Sarah noticed the growing tension in the room. The Redwood brothers began to converse in their native tongue, their expressions increasingly grim. "What is it?" asked Sarah, feeling that she was missing something important. John hesitated before answering. "There are old stories about these mountains in winter. Stories that our people have told for generations, about a hunger that consumes more than just food." Sarah continued to treat Jim, but his words disturbed her. As she cleaned her hands and arms, she found something disturbing, fragments of what appeared to be human bones under her fingernails. Sheriff Mike pulled Sarah aside, keeping his voice low. "We need to keep this quiet for now. The town is already scared enough by the storm and the isolation. If they find out about this..." Sarah agreed, but her scientific mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The wounds on Jim weren't just from exposure to the cold. There were bite marks on his arms, bites that looked human. That night, after returning to her clinic with Jim sedated in one of the beds, Sarah began searching through the old local history books she kept in her library. She found mentions of similar events, periods of extreme isolation during the winter where people mysteriously disappeared. The sound of the wind outside seemed different now, almost like a hungry whale. Sarah looked out of the window and, for a moment, thought she saw a tall, skeletal figure among the trees, but convinced herself that it was just the snow being blown by the wind. A scream from the room where Jim was resting made her run. She found the bed empty, the sheets torn, and the window open, letting in the icy wind and snow. On the windowsill, nail marks and blood formed a disturbing pattern. Sarah rushed to the radio. "Mike, Jim's escaped." "I repeat, Jim has escaped?" The reply came through static. "Stay where you are. We're on our way." And Sarah, "Lock all the doors." While she waited, Sarah realized that the temperature inside the clinic had dropped dramatically, even with the heater running. Her breath formed clouds of steam in the air, and a strange smell, like rotten meat mixed with ice, began to fill the room. The Redwood brothers had mentioned an old story about a hunger that consumed more than just food, about a winter spirit that turned men into monsters. Sarah had always been a woman of science, but that night, as she listened to the strange sounds coming from the forest, she began to question everything she believed she knew about reality. And there were still many weeks of winter ahead. The night wore on as Sarah tried to keep calm in the clinic, the distant sound of howls echoing through the forest. They weren't wolf howls. They were different, more human, and at the same time, charged with a primal hunger that made her stomach turn. Sheriff Mike and his team arrived 20 minutes later, carrying powerful flashlights and rifles. "We found footprints in the snow," said Mike, brushing the snow off his boots. "But they don't make sense. They start off normal, the size of Jim's boots, but gradually they get bigger, much bigger." John Redwood approached the broken window, examining the marks left by Jim. His brother Peter stood near the door, vigilant. "This has happened before," John murmured, his voice laden with concern. "In the stories of our people, when the winter is too long and the hunger too deep." Sarah picked up her medical records, showing them to the group. Before he escaped, Jim showed signs of severe hypothermia, but also physiological changes that I can't explain. His body temperature was absurdly low, but he was still conscious, and his teeth seemed to be getting sharper. A noise from the attic made everyone raise their heads. Mike signaled for two of his deputies to go up and investigate. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the howl of the wind. "We need to find him before." Peter hesitated, exchanging meaningful glances with his brother. "Before the transformation is complete." "Transformation?" Sarah questioned, although part of her already knew the answer. The old stories of the Algonquins, Jim's behavior, the bite marks, everything was beginning to form a terrible picture in her mind. A high-pitched scream cut through the night, coming from the direction of the town market. The group immediately mobilized, running through the deep snow. Sarah insisted on accompanying them, her medical bag firmly in her hands. There was still a chance that she could help Jim in some way. The market was dark, its windows blurred by the cold. Deep scratch marks marked the back door, which had been partially broken down. Mike ordered them to form groups of two. Sarah stayed with John Redwood, while the others spread out around the establishment. "Legend has it that the more they eat, the bigger they get," whispered John as they searched the dark corridors. "But nothing is ever enough. The hunger never goes away." The market shelves were partially empty, the result of the isolation caused by the blizzard. Sarah noticed blood marks on the floor, leading to the meat area. The smell of rotting meat was strongest there. A sound of metal being dragged caught her attention. In the cold room, they found signs that someone had been there recently. Torn packages of meat, bones scattered on the floor. But it wasn't just animal flesh that had been consumed. "My God," Sarah whispered when she noticed the remains of familiar clothes. The same ones Bill Matthews had been wearing when he went hunting with Jim. John abruptly pulled Sarah back as a huge figure passed the entrance to the chamber. For an instant, she glimpsed a figure that her brain refused to process. Something that had once been Jim Cooper, but was now much larger. its skin stretched over elongated bones, needle-sharp teeth visible in a mouth that smiled unnaturally. Gunshots echoed through the market. Mike and the others must have found the creature. Sarah and John ran towards the sounds, only to find 2 wounded deputies and Mike trapped behind an overturned shelf. "He's too fast," shouted Mike, reloading his gun. "And the bullets don't seem to have any effect." Peter emerged from another corridor, carrying something in his hands, an ancient tribal amulet. He began to recite words in his native tongue, causing the creature that used to be Jim to flinch momentarily. Sarah watched in horror as the thing moved impossibly, its limbs too long and disproportionate. Its eyes, once brown, were now as white as ice, and its breath formed crystals in the air. "The whole city is in danger," said John, his voice urgent. "If we don't stop him now, others could be affected. The spirit of the Wendigo is contagious, especially when there's hunger and desperation." Sarah thought of the 300 inhabitants of Pine Creek, the weeks of isolation still to come, the dwindling supplies. The conditions were perfect for the curse to spread. A cry of pain from Mike brought her back to reality. The creature had managed to reach him, its claws leaving deep marks on his arm. Peter continued his chant, louder now, making the monster squirm as if in pain. "We need fire," shouted John. "It's the only thing that can stop it apart from ancient rituals." Sarah remembered the small blowtorch she kept in her medical bag for emergency procedures. It wouldn't be much, but it might be enough to give them a chance. The storm outside seemed to respond to the commotion inside the market, the wind howling harder, the snow beating against the windows as if it wanted to get in. And in the midst of the chaos, Sarah began to understand that this wouldn't just be a fight for survival. It would be a fight for the very humanity of all of them. With torch in hand, Sarah advanced alongside the Redwood brothers. Peter's ritual seemed to have some effect on the creature, which squirmed and emitted guttural sounds that no longer seemed to have any trace of humanity. Mike, despite the wound on his arm, kept a steady aim with his gun. "We need to corner him," shouted John, leading the group in a semicircular formation. The market, with its narrow aisles and high shelves, offered both cover and potential traps. Sarah noticed that her hands were shaking as she prepared the torch. The blue flame seemed insignificant in the face of the horror they were facing, but it was their best chance. The cold inside the market was intensifying by the moment, and ice crystals were beginning to form on the surfaces near the creature. "Look out," warned Peter as the thing that was Jim leapt over a shelf, its elongated limbs moving unnaturally. Sarah caught another glimpse of that distorted face, skin stretched over overgrown bones, eyes as white as the snow outside, and that mouth full of sharp teeth that kept growing. Mike fired once more, hitting the creature in the chest. The impact sent it reeling, but there was no blood, just a hollow sound, as if the bullet had hit ice. The Wendigo responded with a roar that made the windows of the market vibrate. "Sarah, when I say, use fire," instructed John, positioning himself strategically. Peter continued with the ritual. "Mike, keep him distracted." The plan began to form. Peter raised his voice, the ancient words echoing through the marketplace as his tribal amulet glowed with a light of its own. The creature seemed to feel pain from the ritual, its movements becoming more erratic. Sarah noticed something disturbing. The more time passed, the bigger the creature seemed to get. Its joints crackled and stretched like tree branches growing in fast motion. The Wendigo's hunger was literally insatiable, making it grow in proportion to what it consumed, condemning it to an eternal search for more food. One of the wounded deputies managed to crawl to safety, leaving a trail of blood in the snow coming through the broken windows. The metallic smell seemed to drive the creature even madder, and it turned towards the wounded man. "Now," shouted John. Sarah activated the torch just as Peter reached the climax of his chant. The blue flame found the creature just when it was most vulnerable, making it scream in pain. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the odor of rot emanating from the Wendigo. But it wasn't enough. The torch, designed for minor medical procedures, didn't have the power to cause significant damage. The creature recovered quickly and, with one violent movement, threw Sarah against a shelf. The impact left her breathless, and the torch fell from her hands. "Sarah," Mike shouted, running towards her, but the Wendigo was faster. However, before the creature could reach her, John Redwood appeared with an improvised fire extinguisher as a flamethrower, using alcohol from the market shelves as fuel. The explosion of flames drove the monster backwards, its screams now mixing with the howl of the wind. "We need to get him outside," said Peter, his voice hoarse from the continuous ritual. "There's too much risk of setting the whole market on fire in here." Sarah stood up with difficulty, her ribs protesting. Through the pain, she realized that Peter was right. If the fire spread, they could lose the few supplies left for the city. The group began to maneuver strategically, using fire and rituals to guide the creature towards the back exit. The Wendigo, although wounded, was still incredibly agile and strong. Its every move seemed to defy physics, its limbs twisting at impossible angles. "We need more fire," shouted John, as his makeshift extinguisher began to fail. Sarah looked around frantically and then had an idea. "The storeroom, we got kerosene in the back storeroom." Mike understood immediately. "I'll get it. Keep that thing busy." As Mike ran to the storage room, Sarah noticed something worrying. The creature's behavior was changing. There was more method in its movements now, less animal savagery, and more strategy. The ice-white eye seemed to calculate, to plan. "It's adapting," murmured Peter, also noticing the change. "The spirit is becoming stronger." The Wendigo suddenly stopped its attacks, its head tilting unnaturally as it watched the group. A terrible smile formed on its distorted face, and Sarah felt her blood run cold as she realized that the creature had understood something. With an explosive movement, the Wendigo didn't attack the group. Instead, it shot towards the warehouse where Mike had gone to get the kerosene. "No," shouted Sarah, her heart racing as she realized that the creature had identified the greatest threat to her existence. The sound of breaking glass and twisting metal echoed through the market, followed by a scream that could only be Mike's. The group ran towards the warehouse, but Sarah knew they might be too late. The temperature continued to drop, and now Sarah could see her own breath forming crystals in the air. The smell of rot and ice intensified, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move of their own accord, as if winter itself were alive and hungry. In the storeroom, they found the door ripped off its hinges and signs of a struggle. Claw marks covered the walls, and the floor was covered in spilled chemicals, creating a dangerous mixture under their feet. "Mike," called Sarah, her voice shaking not just from the cold. A faint groan came from behind some stacked boxes. Mike was alive but seriously injured. The Wendigo had disappeared, leaving only a hole in the roof of the warehouse through which the snow entered. "He's different now," whispered Mike as Sarah examined his wounds. "It's not just Jim anymore. It's something else. Something worse." John and Peter exchanged worried glances. "The spirit is getting stronger," said Peter, "and now it knows how to defeat us." Sarah finished making a makeshift bandage on Mike, her mind racing with the implications of what had happened. The creature was evolving, learning, and outside, the blizzard continued, isolating Pine Creek from the rest of the world. Winter had barely begun. As Sarah helped Mike to his feet, a terrible thought began to form in her mind. If the Wendigo really was evolving, learning, and becoming more intelligent, the whole town was in even greater danger than they had first imagined. "We need to evacuate the city," said Sarah, leaning Mike on her shoulder. "We can't risk more people being exposed to this." John shook his head negatively. "With this blizzard, the roads are completely blocked. To attempt an evacuation now would be to condemn people to certain death." A distant sound of breaking glass made everyone turn around. Through the fogged-out windows of the market, they saw lights moving in the street. Other residents, probably attracted by the sounds of fighting. "Damn," muttered Mike, trying to straighten up despite the pain. "We need to keep them away from here." Peter checked his watch. "The sun will rise in a few hours. Traditionally, the Wendigo is strongest at night." Sarah began to organize a plan in her mind. "Okay, let's divide up the tasks. Mike, you're too injured to continue. John, take him to the clinic and look out for the other wounded. Peter, you know the legends best. I need you to research more about how we can stop him permanently. What about you? Asked John, worried. I'm going to the community center. We need to organize the residents, establish safety rules. No one should be left alone until we sort this out. As the group split up, Sarah noticed that the temperature had risen slightly. Perhaps Peter was right about the Wendigo's power decreasing during the day, but that meant they had less than 12 hours to prepare for the coming night. At the community center, Sarah found about 30 agitated residents, including Mayor Thompson. News of the events at the market had already spread, albeit distorted by rumors and speculation. Dr. Thompson called out the mayor, his voice tense. Is it true that Jim Cooper has gone mad? They're saying he attacked people in a market? Sarah chose her words carefully. There was an incident, yes. Jim is ill. It's important that everyone stays calm and follows some safety rules until we resolve the situation. As she explained the basic measures, no one should go out alone. All houses should be locked at dusk. Food stocks should be protected. Sarah watched the faces of those present. Some showed fear, others skepticism, but what worried her most were the signs of hunger already visible in some of them. The city's supplies were running out faster than expected. If they didn't get help soon, the shortage would become critical, and with hunger would come desperation. The same kind of desperation that, according to legend, made people vulnerable to the spirit of the Wendigo. Back at the clinic, Sarah found Peter poring over old books and documents. Mike was asleep, sedated, while John tended to the other wounded. I found something, said Peter, showing an old diary. Records of a particularly severe winter in 1887. There were similar reports of transformations, but the tribal elders managed to contain the threat through a specific ritual. What kind of ritual? One that requires sacrifice, replied Peter, his face grim. The Wendigo is a spirit of hunger and greed. To banish it, you must demonstrate the opposite, complete self-sacrifice. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Are you talking about human sacrifice? Not necessarily. The sacrifice can be symbolic, but it must be meaningful, something that represents the rejection of greed that the Wendigo embodies. Before they could argue further, the emergency radio crackled. It was one of the deputies patrolling the western area of the city. Dr. Thompson, we have a situation at the Matthews barn. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, remembering that this was the barn belonging to Bill's family, Jim's hunting partner who had disappeared. I'm on my way. In the barn, Sarah found a disturbing scene. The Matthews family had stored a considerable amount of supplies without informing the rest of the town. Now, other residents had found out, and a heated argument was threatening to escalate into violence. You don't understand, shouted Mrs. Matthews, guarding the entrance to the barn. It's not greed, it's survival. Sarah realized that the situation was a perfect reflection of what the Wendigo represented, how fear and hunger could turn ordinary people into something less than human. And as she tried to calm her nerves, she noticed movement in the shadows of the barn, something moving unnaturally between the ceiling beams. The creature was watching, waiting, and Sarah knew that every moment of conflict and selfishness only made it stronger. The sun began to set over the horizon, painting the snow as red as blood. In a few hours, darkness would take over again, and with it would come the real test for the inhabitants of Pine Creek. Not just a fight against a monster, but a battle against their own most basic fears and impulses. Sarah looked up at the darkening sky, knowing that they needed to find a solution before hunger, both literal and metaphorical, consumed them all. The situation in the Matthews barn was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah realized that she needed to act before violence erupted, both human and supernatural. The Wendigo was still up there, his presence an icy shadow that made the hairs on the back of everyone's neck stand on end. Even if most of them couldn't identify the source of their discomfort. Everyone listen to me. Sarah raised her voice above the din. Fighting over supplies is exactly what we can't do now. It will only make our situation worse. Peter and John Redwood arrived at that moment, bringing with them the ancient diary and their tribal amulets. Seeing the tension in the room, they immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. The spirit feeds on this, whispered Peter, his eyes fixed on the shadows on the ceiling. Every act of selfishness makes it stronger. Sarah had an idea. Turning to the crowd, she began to talk about sharing and togetherness. To her surprise, Mrs. Matthews was the first to give in, perhaps also feeling that evil presence hanging over everyone. "All right," she said, tears in her eyes. "We'll split everything, but it's not just for us. It's for Bill. He's always helped everyone." The mention of Bill created a heavy silence. Everyone there knew that he had disappeared with Jim, and suspicions about his fate were dark. The sound of wood cracking above them reminded Sarah that they didn't have much time. "We need to act now," said John, preparing for the ritual they had discovered. "The symbolic sacrifice needs to be made before night falls completely." Sarah watched as the Redwood brothers organized a circle with ancestral symbols drawn in the snow. The plan was risky. They would use the barn's own supplies as a sacrifice, a physical demonstration of their rejection of the greed that the Wendigo represented. Mike, still wounded but determined, arrived limping with other deputies. "The whole town is coming here," he informed them. "It's as if something is attracting them. It's the spirit," Peter explained. "It wants witnesses. It wants to spread its influence." The ritual began as the last rays of the sun disappeared over the horizon. Peter and John chanted ancient hymns, their voices blending with the icy wind. Sarah and the others formed a larger circle, protecting the ritual from the curious onlookers who kept arriving. It was then that the Wendigo finally revealed itself. The creature that had once been Jim Cooper was now even larger, its distorted form barely resembling something human. Its elongated limbs moved like branches in a storm, and its face was a mask of eternal hunger. Panicked cries echoed through the crowd, but no one ran. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps it was the ritual, but everyone seemed hypnotized by the scene that was unfolding. "Continue the ritual," shouted Sarah when she saw Peter hesitate. "We can't stop now." The Wendigo attacked, but this time it didn't aim at people. It wanted the supplies, the physical source of the greed that fueled it. Its claws sliced through the freezing air, approaching the center of the circle where the food had been placed. It was at that moment that Sarah understood. It wasn't just about burning the supplies, it was about choice, about voluntary sacrifice. Grabbing a torch, she advanced to the center of the circle. "Sarah, now!" shouted Mike, trying to reach her, but she had already made her decision. As a doctor, her duty was to save lives, even if it meant sacrificing something important. With one decisive movement, she set fire to the supplies. The Wendigo roared, a sound that carried all the hunger and despair of the cruelest winter. The fire spread quickly, consuming not only the food, but also years of medical records and equipment that Sarah had stored in the barn, her life's work dedicated to the community. Peter and John intensified their chanting, their voices now carrying real power, almost visible in the freezing air. The Wendigo began to twitch, its impossible body twisting in even more disturbing ways. "It's working," shouted John. "The spirit is losing its anchor." The creature tried one last desperate attack, its claws coming dangerously close to Sarah. But she didn't back down. She stood firm, watching the flames consume not only the supplies, but also the symbol of all the selfishness and greed that had allowed the Wendigo to gain power. With a final scream that made the entire structure of the barn shake, the Wendigo began to fall apart. First its extremities, then its entire body, like snow melting under the sun. In the end, all that remained was a puddle of frozen water, and in the center of it, a human body, Jim Cooper himself again, although irreversibly changed by the experience. The silence that followed was broken by the distant sound of helicopters. The blizzard had finally subsided enough to allow help to reach Pine Creek. In the days that followed, as the town received supplies and medical assistance, Sarah reflected on what they had faced. The Wendigo had been banished, but its lesson remained. In the darkest winters, it is humanity that we must preserve above all else. Jim survived, although he was never the same again. The Redwood brothers remained in town, now respected not just as forest rangers, but as guardians of an ancient and vital wisdom. And when the next winter came, the inhabitants of Pine Creek faced it united, sharing resources and looking out for each other. Because now they knew True monstrosity lies not in cold or hunger, but in choosing to put one's own survival above collective humanity. Sarah kept the Redwoods' old diary in their new clinic, a constant reminder that some battles are won not with force or fire, but with sacrifice and compassion. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howls through the trees, she still looks out of the window, vigilant, not out of fear of the Wendigo, but to ensure that no one in Pine Creek ever faces winter alone again. Winter had set in with unprecedented cruelty in that small village on the edge of the forest. The snow covered the roofs of the wooden houses like a heavy white blanket, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the lament of those struggling to survive. In one of these houses, the most modest of all, lived a family that, like so many others, was facing terribly difficult times. Joao, a 12-year-old boy with curious eyes and brown hair that was always tousled, shared a small room in the attic with his sister Maria, a 10-year-old girl who, despite her young age, already showed wisdom beyond her years. Their days were filled with little adventures around the house, always together, as if they were each other's shadow. The children's father, a lumberjack with calloused hands and a constantly worried expression, spent his days in the forest, trying to make a living from it, which was becoming increasingly scarce. His second wife, a thin woman with a stern look on her face, had joined the family only 2 years ago, after the children's mother died during a particularly cruel winter. Meals, which used to be moments of joy and communion, became silent and tense. The bread, increasingly hard and scarce, was divided into smaller and smaller portions. John and Mary could see the growing despair in the eyes of their father, who could barely look at his children during meals, as if he were carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. One particularly cold night, when the children should have been asleep, altered voices from downstairs caught their attention. John and Mary, driven by curiosity and fear, quietly descended the attic stairs, taking a seat on the top step where they could hear the conversation without being noticed. "There is no other choice," said the stepmother, her voice a whisper full of determination. "We can't feed 4 mouths. We can barely feed ourselves. If we carry on like this, we'll all starve to death." The father protested weakly, his voice laced with anguish. "They're my children. I can't just... Tomorrow, you'll take them to the deepest part of the forest," she continued, ignoring his protests. "Leave them there. Nature will decide their fate. It's cruel, yes, but it's even crueler to watch them all slowly starve to death." John felt Maria tremble beside him and held her hand tightly. In the darkness of the stairwell, the silent tears of the siblings mingled with the muffled sobs of their father, who finally gave in to the terrible plan. That night, while his sister slept a restless sleep, John stayed awake, his young brain working furiously in search of a solution. The full moon illuminated the room through the small attic window, and it was its glow that gave him an idea. He got up quietly and, picking up a piece of hard bread he had saved from his last meal, began to reduce it to crumbs. The next morning, when their father called them for a walk in the woods, John and Mary exchanged meaningful glances. In his pockets, John carried the crumbs that would be his salvation. Maria, who had always been the more observant of the two, memorized every detail of the path, every peculiar tree, every stone that could serve as a reference. The forest swallowed them deeper and deeper. The father, walking ahead, occasionally wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his worn shirt. John discreetly dropped the breadcrumbs, creating a trail that would guide them back home. Maria squeezed her brother's hand tightly, finding courage in each other's presence. After what seemed like an eternity of walking, they reached a small clearing. The father, in a trembling voice, asked the children to wait there while he searched for firewood nearby. "Don't go anywhere," were his last words before disappearing into the trees, leaving his children alone in the cold, green immensity of the forest. The silence that followed was deafening. John and Mary stood still, listening to the sounds of the forest intensifying around them. The wind whispered among the leaves, birds sang somewhere far away, and small animals ran across the ground covered in dry leaves. "He's not coming back, is he?" whispered Maria, her voice small and frightened. John hugged his sister, trying to convey a confidence he didn't fully feel. "Don't worry," he said. "I've left a trail of crumbs. When it gets dark, we'll be able to follow you back home." But as the hours passed and the sun began to set, a terrible discovery awaited them. Searching for the start of the trail of crumbs, they found only a few bird feathers and no sign of the path they had marked. The birds of the forest, hungry as all get out in that cruel winter, had devoured their only chance of return. Darkness began to approach, bringing with it an even more intense chill and even more threatening sounds. John and Mary, now truly lost in the forest, clung to each other, seeking warmth and comfort. Fear was beginning to settle in their hearts, but along with it, a fierce determination to survive, to find a way, to stay together against all the odds the forest could throw at them. What they didn't know was that their journey had only just begun, and that the dangers of the forest would only be the first of many challenges they would have to face. In the growing darkness, something was watching them, something that had long been waiting for visitors like them, something that would make their quest for survival even more desperate than they could have imagined. Night was rapidly advancing over the forest, bringing with it ever-lengthening and threatening shadows. John and Mary, still hugging each other to protect themselves from the biting cold, began to look for a safe place to spend the night. The boy, trying to keep his composure for the sake of his little sister, scoured the surroundings in search of some natural shelter. "There," exclaimed Maria, pointing to a large fallen tree whose exposed roots formed a kind of natural hollow. It wasn't much, but it offered some protection from the icy wind that was starting to blow harder. The brothers settled into the small space, using dry leaves to create an insulating layer between them and the damp ground. Hunger was beginning to set in, painfully reminding them of why they had been abandoned. John searched his pockets, finding just a few crumbs left over from the bread he had used to mark the way. He carefully shared them with Mary, although they were barely enough to full his stomach. "John," whispered Maria, her voice trembling slightly, "do you think there are wolves in this forest?" Before John could answer, a distant howl cut through the night air, making them both shrink even further into their makeshift shelter. The boy hugged his sister tighter, feeling his own heart racing. "Don't worry," he replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "They don't usually get close to people." The night seemed endless. The sounds of the forest, once just a backdrop to their little daytime adventures, now seemed amplified and threatening. Every rustle of leaves, every twig snapping under the weight of some nocturnal animal, startled the siblings. Maria eventually fell asleep in her brother's arms, exhausted by the day's walk and the emotional stress. John, however, stayed awake, determined to protect his sister. He watched the dancing shadows cast by the moonlight through the trees, trying to distinguish real threats from tricks played on his increasingly fertile imagination. With the first ray of sunshine, the siblings woke up completely chilled and even hungrier. Their stomachs rumbled painfully, reminding them that they hadn't eaten properly for days. Leaving their night shelter, they started walking in no particular direction, hoping to find some sign of civilization, or at least something edible. "Look," exclaimed John, pointing to a bush laden with small red berries. Maria, however, grabbed his arm before he could reach them. "Wait," she said firmly. "Remember what Mom taught us? Some berries are poisonous." John stepped back, grateful for his sister's caution. His mother had indeed warned them about the dangers of the forest before she died. They continued walking, now more attentive to their surroundings, looking for signs of the fruits and mushrooms that their mother had taught them were safe to eat. The hours dragged by, and the hunger became harder and harder to bear. The sun was already high in the sky when a sweet, irresistible aroma reached them, making their stomachs growl even louder. It was a smell unlike anything they had ever smelled in the forest. Sweet, inviting, almost magical. "Can you smell it?" asked Maria, her nose moving like that of a small rabbit sniffing the air. John nodded, already moving in the direction of the tantalizing aroma. The siblings began to follow the scent, their tired legs finding new energy in the promise of food. As they advanced, the scent grew stronger, and something began to glow among the trees ahead. Pushing aside some low branches, John and Mary emerged into a small clearing and stood paralyzed at the most extraordinary sight they had ever witnessed. There, as if straight out of a dream, was a house, but it was no ordinary house. It was a building made entirely of sweets. The walls were made of gingerbread, decorated with colored candies and icing. The roof was covered in chocolate tiles, and the windows were made of crystallized sugar that sparkled in the sunlight. A path of different colored stones led to the door, and as they got closer, they realized that they were made of drops and hard candies. "This can't be real," muttered Maria, rubbing her eyes as if she expected the vision to disappear. John approached cautiously and touched one of the walls. His fingers sank lightly into the soft honey bread, and he brought a small piece to his mouth. The taste was more delicious than anything he had ever tasted. "It's real," he exclaimed, already plucking another, larger piece from the wall. "Maria, it's all real food." The hunger that tormented them overcame any vestige of caution. The brothers began to devour pieces of the house, alternating between the gingerbread on the walls and the colorful candies that decorated them. The taste was so wonderful, so beyond their expectations, that for a moment they completely forgot their fear and exhaustion. They were so engrossed in their impromptu feast that they didn't notice when the door to the house opened silently. A figure watched them from the threshold, a strange smile forming on its wrinkled face. It was only when a sweet, melodious voice cut through the air that the children realized they were no longer alone. "Well, well," said the voice, making John and Mary freeze in place, their mouths still full of sweets. "What lovely little visitors I have today." The person at the door was a kind-looking lady, dressed in colorful clothes and an immaculate white apron. Her eyes, however, had a strange glint that made John instinctively take a step in front of his sister. "Poor things, you must be starving," the lady continued, opening the door wider in an inviting gesture. "Why don't you come in? I've got lots more goodies inside, and you look like you could use a nice hot dinner." John and Mary looked at each other, torn between the fear of the unknown and the hunger that had not yet been completely satisfied by the sweets in the house. The lady continued to smile, patiently, as if she had all the time in the world to wait for their decision. What the brothers couldn't know was that, behind that kind smile and the promise of more treats, lurked a danger far greater than anything they had faced so far in the forest. The candy house was just the beginning of an ordeal that would test not only their courage, but also their cunning and, above all, the bond that united them as brothers. The lady stepped forward, and the light coming from inside the house created strange shadows on her wrinkled face. John squeezed Maria's hand, feeling his sister tremble slightly. Hunger, however, spoke louder than fear, and the delicious aroma coming from inside the house was simply irresistible. "Come, come," urged the lady, her voice as sweet as the honey that decorated the walls. "A nice hot soup will do you a lot of good. You're so skinny." With hesitation, the children followed the old woman into the house. The inside was even more impressive than the outside. Candied sugar furniture gleamed under the light of scented candles, and curtains made of caramel threads waved gently. A large wooden table occupied the center of the room, covered with a tablecloth that seemed to be woven from cotton candy. Sit down," said the lady, indicating two stools next to the table. "I'm going to prepare something special for you." As she moved around the kitchen, John and Mary observed every detail of the room. Despite its sweet and welcoming appearance, there was something disturbing in the air. On the walls, John noticed strange marks, as if someone had scratched the sweet surface. Maria, for her part, couldn't take her eyes off a large cage in the corner of the room, partially covered by a dark cloth. The lady soon returned with 2 steaming bowls of soup, the aroma of which made the children's stomachs rumble even more. "Eat it all," she said, her eyes shining in a strange way. "You need to get your strength back." The children began to eat greedily, but John noticed that his hostess kept her eyes on them, especially on her fingers, as if she were evaluating them. The soup was delicious, but there was a strange taste that he couldn't identify, something that made his tongue tingle slightly. "What are your names, dears?" asked the lady, taking a seat at the head of the table. "I'm John, "And this is my sister Mary," replied the boy, noticing that his voice sounded more slurred than usual. His head was beginning to feel heavy, and the candles seemed to create dancing shapes on the walls. "What lovely names," smiled the lady, but her smile now seemed different, more predatory. "You could call me Griselda." Maria had already finished her soup, and her eyes were beginning to close against her will. John struggled to stay alert, but his limbs felt heavier and heavier. The last thing he saw before succumbing to sleep was Griselda's smile, turning into something terrible, and her eyes glowing with a green, unearthly light. When John woke up, he found himself inside the large cage he had noticed earlier. His hands and feet were tied with ropes made of licorice, and his head was still spinning from the effects of the potion Griselda had put in his soup. Maria was in a separate cage, still unconscious. "Ah, she's finally awake," said Griselda, her voice now completely different from the melodious one that had greeted them. It was harsh and cruel, matching her true appearance, which was now revealed. A witch with long, twisted fingers, a pointed nose and eyes that shone with an ancient malice. "What are you going to do to us?" asked John, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear he felt. "Oh, my dear," laughed the witch, the sound resembling fingernails scratching a blackboard. "You'll be my dinner, of course. But first, I need to fatten you up a bit. You're too thin for a good meal." At that moment, Maria began to awaken, her eyes widening in horror as she realized her situation. The witch approached her cage, appraising her with critical eyes. The girl first, decided Griselda. Younger children are always more tender. John felt his blood run cold. "No," he shouted, shaking the bars of his cage. "Leave my sister alone." The witch only laughed, a horrible sound that made the sweets on the walls shake. "Don't worry, little one. Your shift will come soon. But first, let's start feeding your little sister properly." Thus began a terrible period for the siblings. The witch forced Mary to eat huge quantities of sweets and treats, while John was fed only hard breadcrumbs. Her plan was clear. She wanted to fatten Mary up first, keeping John too weak to try anything. But the witch didn't count on the children's cunning. During the evenings, when Griselda retired to her room upstairs, John and Mary whispered to each other, planning their escape. Maria had noticed that the witch had very poor eyesight and relied mainly on her sense of smell and touch to guide her. John, for his part, carefully observed the witch's routine, memorizing every detail of her habits. Every morning, Griselda would check on Maria's progress by asking her to extend a finger through the bars of the cage. The witch poked it, grumbling about how the girl was still too thin. What she didn't know was that Maria, following John's idea, had started extending a small chicken bone they had found on the floor of the cage, deceiving the witch about her true state. The days turned into weeks, and the witch's patience began to wear thin. Maria remained thin despite all the food, and John, although weak from lack of food, kept his mind sharp, observing and planning. The children knew they had to act soon, before Griselda realized the trick or decided she had waited long enough. One particularly dark night, while the witch was snoring in her room, John whispered to his sister, "Tomorrow, Maria. Tomorrow we'll try. Remember the plan?" Maria nodded in the darkness, clutching the chicken bone in her hand. "I remember, John, but I'm scared." "I'm scared too," John admitted, "but it's our only chance. We have to outsmart her." The brothers stayed awake for the rest of the night, their hearts beating fast at the prospect of what was to come. The plan was risky, and if they failed, there certainly wouldn't be a second chance. But as John had said, it was their only hope of survival. As the first rays of sunlight began to enter through the crystallized sugar windows, the brothers heard the witch's heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. It was time to put their plan into action and find out if their cunning would be enough to overcome the evil that held them prisoner. The sun had barely risen when Griselda descended the stairs, her heavy footsteps echoing through the candy house. She approached Maria's cage first, as she always did, her eyes emitting that greenish, evil glow. "Good morning, little one," hummed the witch in her fake voice. "Let's see if you're ready for my feast." Maria, trembling slightly, held out the chicken bone through the bars. The witch felt it with her gnarled fingers, frowning in frustration. "Impossible. exclaimed Griselda, her voice filled with rage. "How can you still be so thin with all that food?" It was at this point that John put the first part of the plan into practice. "Maybe," he said, his voice weak but determined, "she needs something more substantial than sweets." The witch turned to him, puzzled. "Go on," she ordered, her eyes shining with renewed interest. "Our mother always said that roast meat was the best way to put on weight quickly." John continued, praying that his voice didn't betray his nervousness, especially if it's well seasoned and cooked in the oven. A mischievous smile spread across the witch's wrinkled face. "Yes, yes," she murmured, rubbing her hands together. "That makes sense, and I happen to have an excellent oven." Griselda moved quickly through the kitchen, lighting the large stone oven that took up an entire wall. The flames soon began to crackle, casting dancing shadows across the candy house. "I need to check that it's the right temperature," said the witch, more to herself than to the children. "It has to be perfect." John and Mary exchanged meaningful glances. It was exactly what they had planned. The witch was so engrossed in her preparations that she didn't notice when John started fiddling with the lock of his cage with a piece of wire he had found a few days earlier. "Come here, little girl," Griselda ordered, opening Maria's cage. "I want you to help me check the oven." Maria hesitated, but knew she needed to keep the witch distracted while John worked on her release. She approached the oven with faltering steps, observing the flames that licked the inside of the stone structure. "I can't see properly if it's hot enough," complained the witch, her poor eyes hampering her assessment. "Get in there and tell me how the flames are." Maria took a step back, feigning fear. "I don't know how to do that," she said, her voice trembling. Griselda snorted with impatience. "You fool. Just go in and look. Like this, look." The witch leaned into the oven, demonstrating what she wanted Maria to do. At that very moment, John finally managed to open his cage. With an agility that surprised even him, considering his weakness, he jumped out and ran silently to his sister. The moment the witch was leaning completely over the oven, John and Mary gathered all their strength and pushed her over. Griselda let out a horrifying scream as she fell into the burning oven. Maria quickly closed the heavy iron door, while John locked the bolt. The witch's screams and imprecations echoed through the candy house, making the gingerbread walls shake. The children hugged each other, their hearts beating wildly, as the sounds diminished until they ceased altogether. "We did it," whispered Maria, still hardly believing it. But there was no time for celebration. John was already rummaging through the house, looking for supplies to take with him on his escape. In the kitchen, they found a cloth bag which they filled with bread and dried fruit. Maria discovered a small chest full of gold coins and jewelry, probably stolen from other victims of the witch. "Should we take it?" she asked hesitantly. John considered for a moment before replying, "Yes. We can use it to help our family and other needy people in the village." As they prepared to leave, something extraordinary began to happen. The candy house began to melt and crumble, as if the witch's death had broken some enchantment that kept it standing. Chocolate dripped down the walls, and the crystallized sugar on the windows dissolved like snow in the sun. "Quick," shouted John, grabbing his sister's hand. "We got to get out of here." The children ran out of the collapsing house, carrying their precious supplies. Behind them, the magical construction had completely melted away, leaving only a giant puddle of melted sweets on the forest floor. The sun was high in the sky now, and for the first time in weeks, John and Mary could feel its rays warming their faces. The forest seemed different, less threatening. It was as if the witch's death had dispelled a dark mist that hung over that part of the forest. "Which way should we go?" asked Maria, looking around. John closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the stories his mother used to tell him about how to find her way around the forest. "Moss always grows on the north side of the trees," he said, "and our village lies to the south of the deep forest." So the brothers began their journey home, stronger and wiser than when they had been abandoned. The weight of the sack of provisions and the treasure chest was barely noticeable, so great was their relief at being free. As they walked, they talked about what they would tell their father and how they could use the witch's gold to help not only their family, but the whole community that was suffering from hunger. The sun was beginning its descent over the horizon when they spotted a familiar puff of smoke rising above the trees. "It's the chimney of the blacksmith's house," exclaimed Maria, recognizing the pattern of the smoke. The brothers' hearts were filled with renewed hope. They were almost home, but they knew that their adventure had changed their lives forever. They were no longer just two frightened children in the forest. They were survivors who had faced evil and won through their cunning and brotherly love. "Dad, Father," Maria's joyful cries cut through the air as she and John ran towards the little wooden house they knew so well. The woodcutter, who was sitting on a tree stump in front of the house with his face buried in his hands, raised his head when he heard the familiar voices of his children. His eyes, red and swollen from crying, widened in disbelief. In an instant, he was on his feet, running towards the children with open arms. The encounter was an explosion of emotions. Tears, hugs, and words of joy and regret. "My children, my dear children," the father sobbed, clutching them to his chest as if he feared they would disappear again. "Forgive me, please forgive me. I should never have—" "It's all right, Dad," John interrupted, his voice soft and understanding. "We know you had no choice." His stepmother, drawn by the commotion, appeared at the door. Her normally stern face showed signs of surprise and, curiously, relief. In the days since abandoning the children, the weight of her decision had begun to eat away at her conscience. "You've come back," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But how?" Maria and John looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They decided at that moment that some parts of their story would be better kept secret. After all, who would believe a house made of sweets in an evil witch? "We found help in the forest," replied John diplomatically, adjusting the weight of the bag of provisions on his shoulders. "And we brought something that can help not only our family, but the whole village." Carefully, he opened the sack and showed its contents, first revealing the food they had collected. Then Maria presented the small chest. When she opened it, the glitter of gold and jewels made the adult's eyes widen in amazement. "Mercy!" exclaimed the stepmother, putting her hands to her mouth. "Where did all this come from?" "It's a gift," said Maria firmly, "to help people who are starving." In the weeks that followed, remarkable transformation took place in the small village. The treasure found by the children was used wisely. They bought seeds to plant, animals to raise, and tools to work the land. The father, now freed from the constant worry about immediate survival, was able to devote his time to teaching other families more efficient farming techniques. The stepmother, touched by the generosity of the children she had condemned, changed profoundly. Her heart, previously hardened by bitterness and fear of hunger, began to open. She became a central figure in organizing community efforts, ensuring that no family went without. John and Mary grew up respected in the community, not only for their mysterious good fortune, but above all for the wisdom they showed despite their young age. At night, when the younger children of the village gathered around the fire, they would tell stories, some true, some imagined, about the dangers and wonders of the deep forest. Sometimes, when they were alone, the brothers would talk about their adventure in the candy house. Although the horror of those days never completely left them, they also remembered how that experience had strengthened the bond between them and taught them valuable lessons about courage, cunning, and the importance of trusting each other. "You know, John," Maria said one afternoon, as they watched the sunset from the attic window they still shared, "sometimes I wonder if other lost children found that clearing after the candy house melted." John smiled, taking his sister's hand. "If they did, I hope they only found wild flowers and edible mushrooms. The witch is gone, and with her evil magic." Time passed, and the story of John and Mary became a legend in the village, whispered from generation to generation. It told of two children who faced adversity with courage and came back not only with gold, but with something much more valuable. The wisdom that true treasure lies in the love between siblings and the strength that comes from facing fears together. The winters were still harsh, but the village was now prepared to face them. The families had learned to work together, share resources, and look after each other. And when the snow covered the roofs and the wind howled through the trees, people gathered in their warm homes, telling stories about two brave children who changed the fate of an entire community. John and Mary grew up keeping the memory of their adventure alive, not as a horror story, but as a reminder that even in the darkest of situations, hope and cunning can light the way back home.